Seriously, I think we should.
Oh, good. I hope you will. Good morning, everyone. We're glad you're here. The winter weather has affected some of our Florida citizens. Mr. Shercliffe is ill, Mr. Miller is ill, so they won't be here. And Sherry McGill has got a DuPont long scheduled board meeting for 2 days, and Greg Smith called yesterday, and he's got a Bank of America meeting that he just picked up. So we are without them, but we will look for them at our next meeting. The cold weather didn't harm our more northern friends. David Drain flew from Detroit, stood by there for hours, and ended up in Tampa last night and drove from Tampa here. So that shows he's dedicated to our work. Katie Solinsky, who is new from Pew, but she also came in, I think, probably from Washington. But we're glad you're here too, Katie. And Jonathan Trichter came from New York, and he got in late last night. So we're grateful to all of them for being here. With that, why don't we introduce ourselves on the task force for the record, and then we can proceed. So Gwen, why don't you start?
Gwen Yates, task force member.
I'm Kelly O'Leary, task force member.
John Wilmane. David Moore.
Carl Cannon.
Bill Shy.
John Thompson.
Bill Rupp.
Kirsten Doolittle.
Charlie Appleton. Ted Delagal.
Great. Well, thank you all again for being here. I have a few remarks that I'd just like to frame our discussions with this morning. The first is that this is our first meeting since Chester died. So I want to thank publicly Chester's service here and so many other ways to our community. And so I hope that not only for the community as at large, but to really sort of honor Chester and his work, that we dig in and keep going forward. Because Chester always did that, and he always did it with a smile on his face. So let's remember that our work is important, but it's not the end of the world either. So let's have some, let's be cheerful about what we do. That's the way he would do. I also want to say, I don't know if y'all noticed in the obituaries, but Ted Delagal's father died last week, and we want to express our condolences for that. With that, I wanted to just discuss briefly Judge Wallace's order as I understand it, and I don't know if any of y'all have actually read the order, but the paper has reported on it, and here's my take on it. The judge concluded, he concluded definitely that in terms of pension benefits, that is subject to collective bargaining under the applicable statutes. The implication, although he never said it, but the implication is that since the 30-year agreement wasn't conducted in the sunshine, that may be an issue. But he didn't conclude that, and as far as we have now, the 30-year agreement is still in place. But that's a clear implication. So the way where I end up, well, and in paragraph 5 of the order, or page 23, he enjoined the city and the police and fire pension fund from having conversations or contacts with each other, their agents, their representatives, and even their attorneys, which was a little surprising because you'd expect attorneys to be able to not negotiate, but at least to call and see where things are going procedurally. But it's a pretty broad paragraph. I construed the word city, since we are an agency or a board or whatever we are of the city appointed by the mayor and reporting to the mayor, and we are subject to the sunshine laws. We've been proceeding, and presumably then we are part of the city. So that then meant to me, as to pension design, we can't have out of the sunshine meetings between John Keene, for example, and myself as representatives of the two different bodies. As to pension design, as I further studied the order, My conclusion is, as to the remainder of the subjects we've concerned ourselves with, that is governance, funding the unfunded liability, and investment authority, those are really matters between the fund and the city, and they don't involve pension benefits. So the way I read the order, we can still have those conversations. Now, Wayne Zell may report on that and go back, and they may go back to Judge Wallace and ask him to expand it. That's the way I view it now. So that's the way we're proceeding. John and I have had talks over the past several months, as you can imagine, but I really think we've never talked about pension design. We may have collaborated, but certainly not since the injunction. So that's the way I see the order, and if any of y'all have any questions about that, I'll be happy to try to answer them, and both Cindy and Jim Lynn are here too. Any questions? And they may come up later, but that's the way I see it. The presentations today inform each other. The subcommittee that David Gore chaired and John Thompson and Bob Miller were on, and I think some of you listened into their meetings last week. They have really done superb work, supported by David Drain particularly, in the modeling. The report David Gore circulated yesterday, some of you may not have had a chance to read it. I read it this morning. It really articulates, for those of us who are not experts in this at all, most of it I could understand. Parts of it we're still going to need some help with. But that will then feed into, you'll see, David's going to present their report, and John will chime in. But that will then inform the governance stuff, which I hope you all have had a chance to read. And that then will inform the pension design piece that David Drain will then pick up. And then we'll lead into some observations from John Keene and from Chris Hand. So it's all of a piece the way this is structured this morning, leading us to next week when the city intends to make some additional presentations. So that's where we are. And I just forgot to introduce the mayor, who needs no introduction. He takes this so seriously. We're grateful that you've taken your busy time to be with us today. So thank you very much. Great. So with that, I'll turn it over to David Gore, and thank you again for all the hard work. And y'all should have, you may not have printed it, but their committee report.
So
Welcome, Mr. Anderson.
So our thanks as well to all the folks that you've mentioned there, Bill. What I thought we would do today is, rather than go through a detailed presentation, because I think the report does a fair job of trying to lay it out in a very systematic manner, but I thought what's most important is that we sort of have an understanding of what we're trying to do here and what we did and what we came up with. So it's a conversational style of presentation that I would hope to give you this morning. And as you'll recall, the subcommittee really got formed because there were 2 or 3 questions that came up that we were trying to deal with. One was, well, how do we think about affordability? And we look at all these different choices. What's affordable and what's not affordable? Secondly, we said, is there a way that we can think about funding, and how do we put our resources against that? And thirdly, we said, what do these different choices cost, and how do you think about cost? And so our effort was a little bit like, if you'll remember the days of having to put up a pup tent. If you had to put up a pup tent in the wind, before you put up the 2 end poles, you had to tie down the 4 corners. So a lot of what we did, quite frankly, was trying to tie down those 4 corners. And the reason this stuff is so hard is because we're really trying to estimate today things that are going to play out over 20 or 30 years. And the single most important thing in all this work is understanding how your investments are going to perform, because that's so tied into what we're doing. So a lot of what we did was to try to get a point of view around what's a good investment return assumption. Pew helped us with that, and David Drain brought to the forefront the expectation that we're going to be using, we left as a presumption that we'd use a 7% rate of return, and 6 3/4 to 7% was sort of a median rate of return. What does that mean? That means 50% of the time you're going to make more than that, and 50% of the time you may make less than that based upon historical asset performance. And so we said, well, when you think about affordability is really the concept of saying, what do we have available to us to pay for our benefits, and what are our benefits going to cost? And so when we're estimating affordability, we need to be prepared not only for what we think is going to happen, which is earn a 7% return, but we got to be prepared to sustain it through a higher level of probability where, in fact, that won't happen. And so the subcommittee recommended that we would use a 5.4% investment return assumption. And that comes from the work of Pew that basically concluded that if you want, that 5.4% represents what you will earn 70% of the time. So there's a 25% chance you could get it wrong, and there's a 75% chance you'll get it right if you use 5.4%. We debated, well, 75% is great. It'd be nice to know that we have a higher confidence level. And so if you looked at a 90% kind of probability, then you'd be down to a 3.9% return. Certainly things could go much better, and 25% of the time we could earn 8.3. So it was the balancing between wanting to come up with a reasonable assumption, a safe assumption, an assumption we could rely upon, and that would be sustainable over the long term, but not also address an assumption that was so draconian that could force the natural consequences that come from that. That you have to come up with more money, you have to divert resources from other places, you may go into a plan that looks to be more expensive than it is. And so the first recommendation of the subcommittee was, in all this work that we do, as we think about affordability and what cash we can afford, 5.4% is the right way to think about it. And actually, if there's questions as we go along, it may actually be helpful to everybody. So please interrupt me if you'd like to pause on anything. The second thing that we talked about was cost, and why does cost matter? And I mean, in a certain sense, if we project our cash flows, cost is really there only because you may want to have a point of view about how you compare among choices. And so if we looked at alternative plan designs, which we may not look at all those designs, but if you considered a defined contribution plan as one end of the spectrum and a defined benefit as the other, the cost for those will be very different when you consider the fact that one involves investment returns. And so we said, when you look at the cost of the plan, you have to recognize that the city signs up for a benefit that it commits to pay no matter what. And if returns don't perform, it underwrites that obligation and it will put in the funds necessary to satisfy it. So in a certain sense, cost is driven by what's a reasonable, safe expectation as to the time value of money. And different groups look at it in different ways. Pension and actuarial accounting for public plans has always said, use the investment return as a way to discount your future payments so you know what today's cost is. And so you can say, the dollar that I promised an employee 30 years from now, what does that cost today as a part of his salary? But financial accounting standards and certainly economic considerations would not do that, because it mixes really two things. It mixes the return that comes from earning an investment with the fact that you actually have a future commitment. And so in looking at the alternatives there, 5.4% also is, quite frankly, a very simple area to get rough justice around a fair way to look at how do you discount it for cost purposes. Our choices would include using a AA bond rate as what's a safe return investment. At the end of 2013, those rates are below 5%. The Wall Street Journal had a recent article that addressed this very thing and said, in the past, those rates have been over 6, and they've also, been a lot lower than 4. The 5.4, we believe, is a fair way to say, if you take a long-term view as to sort of what safe bond rates will earn, it's in that same neighborhood, and it certainly makes it a lot simpler to use the same rate for both purposes. And so we've said, so for purposes of answering the question, well, how does this choice compare with that choice? and knowing that we don't want to count on value created by the city taking investment risk, the right way to distill that down for an apples and apples comparison is to use a 5.4 discount rate in coming up with cost. The third area was in funding. And you'll recall the earlier work that we had from Pew said, if you take our current state and the benefit plan that we have today, it will require payments by the city that start off at $140 million and go up to approaching $400 million. When we use the 7% return, it's slightly over $400 million. We all said, signing up for a proposal that says we're going to be paying $400 million a year in the final year is not the right way to do this. And so subcommittee, take this on, think about it, come up with some suggestions. To that end, we had as a starting point, Charlie, your help in saying, well, here's a number to start with. We have $120 million that we think comes out of what's existing budgetary allocations. Perhaps we could get $90 million from tax revenues. Let's start with 210 as a flag in the sand for purposes of understanding where we go from here. And so everything builds from starting from someplace. So for purposes of the subcommittee's work, we looked at things relative to $210 million. And the choices that Pew helped us identify were to say that while we would go from 140 to 400, if we were to expect a 7% return on our investments, which is not the safe investment, the safe pattern, but it's what we expect, then a level payment of $190 million a year through 2036 would address the benefit plan. Now, for this work, Pew had to take a point of view as to, well, what's the benefit that I'm modeling, right? And so what they modeled in their work, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but what they modeled in their work was the MSP proposal, but with an increase of employee contributions by an additional 1%, so up to 10% employee contributions. They also assumed that new employees would have a total benefit arrangement that would have a cost of about 10% of salary when measured at 7%. So that isn't exactly what's been articulated in the MSP. It's a little bit tighter, but it's what was used for their purposes of modeling. So rough justice with what we have today. And so a level payment of $190 million a year would accomplish that. Now, because the subcommittee said, well, we may or may not earn 7%. Let's count earning 5.4. What's it cost? What's our forecast cash stream that's going to be necessary to pay for this by 2036 if we only earn 5.4%? And that number was going to be computed in the interim period by David, but we speculated at our meeting that we're probably in the neighborhood of $220 million. So within shouting distance of the 210 that we've talked about. And towards that then summary of choices, the subcommittee's recommendation was several things. We said, we want to put some of this behind us. We want to make progress to the extent it's within reasonable capability and feasibility for the city to do that. We want to address the existing unfunded liability and do more than the minimum. We don't want to pay just the 140. So our proposal was to enter into an arrangement where we would pay the funding cost required if we assumed we can only make 5.4%. And that's based upon the final plan as it will be configured. And that final plan, through a combination of plan design, employee contributions, or other arrangements, we suggest, has to be confined to something that can be afforded at $210 million a year with a 5.4% return assumption. Now, while we expect that we may do better than 5.4%, we would continue down this path until we reach some targeted amount of funding satisfaction. So we didn't actually reach a final conclusion with this within the couple days the subcommittee had, but I would think for purposes of what we're talking about, if you reach 80% funding perhaps, you would start to step it back, but we would identify as a team a pattern and a methodology for how we'd start out with paying more than we need to do to satisfy the minimum, the $210 million, which hopefully satisfies 5.4% returns. We'd step that down once we'd had success in getting a lot better funding ahead of us. And while we're doing this, we're really doing this as on a voluntary basis. We're saying that for actuarial purposes, it's still appropriate to use the 7% because that's the most likely expectation as to what our benefits are going to earn. And so we wouldn't embed within the actuarial analysis a hard-coded requirement that we have to use 5.4. We'd use our real expectations, which are 7, but we would voluntarily commit and maybe contractually commit, depending upon how this is negotiated, to begin a funding pattern that makes significant headway towards getting this behind us. And that really was, in large part, the work of the committee. We did leave several things that were open that we didn't address. We didn't address matters of plan design, and it would be our expectation that when we think about what's the cost of the benefits for existing employees, what's the cost of benefits for new employees, that we would reduce that down to some kind of a cost understanding using the 5.4%. We didn't look at what are other cities paying and how do you come up with a plan design that's competitive. And we need to still tie down that whether the $220 million estimate that David gave us is realistic. And we also said there should be a consideration of, to the extent we want options on the table for how existing employee benefits could be curtailed, recognizing that that plan is very expensive on a normal cost basis. The COLA would be probably a practical place to focus if you had to find a place to further constrain it. And so Pew was asked to do some consideration of that, but I think they're going to be doing that for the benefit of the task force.
David, I'll open for questions and discussion in a minute, but on the bifurcation of the 7% actuarial regulatory requirement on the assumed rate of return compared to the 5.4% contribution, sacrificial contribution rate, I'll call it. We talked also about from the perspective of the city council, if that is an alternative to saying 5.4%, we'd figure out what that was and commit to a dollar amount so that they'd be able to plan further ahead.
Yeah, that's a good clarification.
Some have a fixed dollar, right? So that would.
Good point. Yep. We'd have to sort of determine at 5.4% what's the number that's necessary to amortize. But if that happens to be the 210, then we would commit to the 210, not to a calculation at the 5.4. That's right. We commit to a dollar amount.
Questions, thoughts, John?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. David, a couple of questions, and I was on a call for some of your subcommittee meetings, not the whole thing. And I think I understand what you've explained here, although I'm a little bit confused by it simultaneously using the 7% and the 5.4% at the same time. I remember seeing a slide at the subcommittee, and I think it was using a 7% return. I'm not sure of that. That at the $210 million level, that after 7 years, that could drop back to the 120 and still fully fund by 2036. What I'm reading here, it sounds like you're saying you have to continue that throughout each year until 2036 to fully fund. Is that what I'm reading? Because I thought it was just a 7-year increased contribution, then it could drop down.
Yeah, David, I think the 190 was what was necessary to amortize through 2036, and
The question is, do you want to assume any sort of growth in this due to inflation, or so if you want to, the 210 initial analysis was based on we're going to start paying 210, we're going to expect those revenue streams to grow by inflation, and keep paying that in, and because that payment is growing each year, you pay things off faster. The stable funding plan, which starts off at $190 million, that's fixed at a nominal amount. So it doesn't grow per inflation. Anything from that revenue stream, if it's property taxes go up, or property values go up, any additional money that would be brought in instead goes to the city budget. So it's a question of, do you want a payment that's going to be completely stable over time, or do you want one that's going to grow? And if you're going to pay less in the back end, you need to pay more in the front end.
I understand that, but the slide I'm recalling, though, it showed that payment, it was a level payment amount for the first 7 years, and then it dropped down to the 120 for the remaining period. Am I just remembering that slide wrong?
So
I remember the 190 being inflated thought it was, or whatever the number was, 190 or 210, whatever it was.
Yeah, so, and, you know, kind of the initial set of slides, everything was adjusted for inflation, so it was stable in terms of real dollars, but the actual amount that would have gone in each year was going to, 210 the first year, 220 million the second year. It would grow each year. And then after 7 years, some of that additional payment went away, and a lower, and the contribution went back to a lower base, but that lower base would grow each year. So it's, do you want something that grows based on inflation, or do you want something that is going to be static?
David, I think what he's referring to is on Thursday in the first subcommittee meeting, there was a higher 7-year pay, and then it dropped, and we asked for Friday to have a level payment, and that level payment, I think, ended around $190,000 for 20 years. And that was because the task force as a whole wanted to look at a level payment stream rather than front-loading or back-loading, and the 7 years appeared to be front-loading.
And on the funding side, both of those payment plans would have worked. It's, so the question is not on the pension side, but on the funding side, which of these better match, how we want, or how you want Jacksonville's resources to be used. Do you want more on the front end and less in the back, or do you want something stable? But both of those funding approaches pay down the unfunded liability.
Let me respond to, I think this, maybe you've got your answer, but the slide you're talking about is another choice. It's, rather than paying 190 as a level payment, you could instead pay 210 and then drop it down to a lower amount. So you're right, there's many different alternatives for how you would scale the payments. We said, when we circle back, a couple things. What are our priorities? One, we think we need to be paying off initially, assuming a 5.4% return, so that becomes sustainable. And I think what we're going to find, if we use the 5.4% return, we're going to already start off at that much higher level of payment requirement. The point that would then say, well, if we start off paying that much and we actually earn 7, we might be able to start to ratchet back. And I think that's exactly right. And then the question is, well, when do you start to ratchet back? And I think that would be answered by looking at how we're doing on our funding status. And if we are 50% funded, do we start to feel really good? Or do we wait till we're 80% funded to start to feel really good? Or do we do something more? I think we don't want to become overfunded. I think, but that's where that would come to bear, I think.
That was actually my second question, because the recommendations here assume full funding. And so I would have thought we wanted really to achieve 75 to 80% funding, because there's a ton of assumptions inherent in the actuarial calculations. And we don't know exactly what the right number will be. That's just an estimate of what it would be. You just indicated we probably don't want to be 100% funded. To me, it would seem like the objective would be in that 75 to 80% funded is success.
Right.
Because there's going to be investment gains and investment losses, and all kind of things are going to happen between now and 2036. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and that ultimately will be for the task force to make a recommendation, whether it's 100%, 75%, 80%. And my point earlier, that ties into the governance, because you'll notice in paragraph 9 of the governance recommendations, one thing the subcommittee also talked about was, how do we bind the policymakers to this? Why, John Thompson kept asking, well, what if they change their minds? So if we could use the structure of the 30-year agreement, reduce it to the period of time that we fund whatever that percentage is, 80% or whatever, or a fixed date. I think in the governance memo it's 10 years. I think that's right. So what that would entail would be entering into either modifying the existing agreement or having a new agreement whereby the city would agree to fund at that level, whatever that was, until such time as you reached 80% funding or the drop dead date. And during that time, that would control. So that would be a contract between the city and the fund, and would then bind the city to perform that contract over the years. But you would still use, for actuarial purposes, the 7.4%. Is that, John? 7% for the actuarial regulatory requirements, but it's a voluntary contribution as if it were 5.4%. That's what I understood the subcommittee to be recommended. John?
One data point to consider is what we also uncovered in the subcommittee meeting is the amount of money going out of the plan each year to pay for current benefits is currently, or a year ago, 2012, was $120 million. So we're going to put in 190, but only 70 is really being invested. And that is part of the issue of when you've got a plan in declining funding status. Another point to consider, which was brought up by the actuaries, one of the theories that they share for us to consider is if you're going to increase the funding, whether you front-loaded or back-loaded or level-loaded, is to consider the generational impact. Are you going to be having this generation pay more today versus having the next generation pay more tomorrow? And ideally, I think we're looking for that level, let's spread it across all generations. This is everybody's problem. And that's where we arrived at the $190 million for 20 years. That $120 million going out is going up. And so we don't have data on what it's going up every year. We don't have data as whether or not it'll increase above $190 million in 10 years. So there's still some loose ends in some of this work, but those are the risks if we don't begin paying more today. One of the things that we requested was to take a look at an actuarial assumption and actuarial plan for the 5.4% to be the discount rate. Looking at the numbers, if you don't inflation adjust them, if you just look at the pure numbers of what you owe as a city, my suspicion is at the 5.4% discount rate, our cumulative cost to the city over 40 years will be less because of our current funding status than at 7, because of the impact of inflation going out 20 years from now. Because we would still pay less today at a 7% discount rate than if we had a 5.4. So that was something, I'm not sure if it's in the slides today, but we ought to look at, as a committee, cumulative cost to the city. Total cost over 30 or 40 years to get this paid to where the funding status that we agree makes sense. Shouldn't we be looking at what the best total cost plan is?
Yeah, so, and we'll talk about that, and ultimately, we'll need to make a decision on that. David Drain has got models of pension designs going forward, and I don't really know where y'all want to, do you want to wait till next time to adopt a recommendation, to adopt these recommendations, the three or four recommendations? There was or do you want to wait, or do you want to do that today? My gut tells me we should wait and let this sort of settle. We can't really talk to each other, but we can talk to David Drain, and we can talk to.
Yeah, I think waiting makes sense.
Yeah.
I think what we have is a rough sizing.
Yeah.
Or do we have something that we can't manage, or is it manageable within our feasibility? And then the detail work will be, as we look at individual plan designs and individual funding strategies and what number do we sign up for, that's got to fit together with part of a final proposal.
At the whole end of the day, we put the whole model together.
Right.
Okay. Yes, Kirsten.
David, I think I understand the idea about when and why we're going to use the 5.4%, but I don't think I understand for what purposes we're going to use 7%, a 7% rate of return. Can you help me with that?
I'll try, and our actuaries should tell me if there's better thinking on this, but in my mind, we have a requirement to do actuarial calculations. That requirement under state, probably regulations, defines what minimum amounts have to be paid. So we could sign up for a much more conservative investment expectation, or a much more reliable investment expectation, by doing as part of our actuarial filings, where it's hard-coded into what we've got to do as the minimum payments. Or, quite frankly, the 7% as an absolute expectation is not wrong. It's just that for purposes of assessing affordability and sustainability, we may not make that, right? So I don't know that we challenge that 7% for purposes of the way actuarial assumptions and questions are asked is the wrong answer. But we're saying for purposes of understanding affordability, for purposes of understanding cost, it is the wrong answer. So let's voluntarily make the higher payments that arise out of the economic way of looking at it, but not necessarily bring on the city a requirement that it be forced under actuarial standards to use the other. Now, it may be that the actuarial answer is you can't have it both ways. You fish or cut bait and have to go to the same methodology. But our subcommittee's view was it's better not to hard code it into the actuarial process.
And that's one additional reason that we decided, rather than to have the two different rates, that we would agree on a level dollar amount.
On a level
Because
dollar.
then it does become
Right.
unchained to the actuarial.
Right.
It's voluntary rather than making the state say, you have to do it this way. It's a voluntary commitment.
Carl? We really believe, based on what you expect, that we're going to do 5.4 at a 75%. There's a 75% chance that we're going to do 5.4, right?
We believe 75% chance we're going to do 5.4. That's right.
And considering the political environment that we have, to your point about contractually tying it up, we have got to make some kind of a recommendation that ties it up, because the political environment, the mayor's office builds a budget, the city council works the budget, and we're talking about a voluntary $50, $80, $90 million number, and this is the same entity that is running $1.5 billion behind, that all of the sins of the past have led to the $1.5 billion. And somehow we have really got to be strong, contractually or otherwise, or humans and human nature plays out and they're going to go right back to where they were.
I think forced discipline is a valid comment. I think the other, if you think about what's the other consequence of the two ways, 10 years from now, if we do earn 7%, and we're doing pretty well, but we're not fully funded, the actuarial assumption of 5.4% may cause us to continue to pay higher payments than we otherwise would if we could use a 7% assumption, I think. So it's not so much in the first 10 years that it's going to matter. It's really more when you start to find a way that you want to, but maybe we have the flexibility to change our assumptions as long as they're reasonable and not be bound by that, so that we could hard code it at a 5.4 and then revisit it once we get to a funding status at 7% that looks reasonable. But I think the question is, are you 80% funded or not, is a question you're going to want to answer with a 7% assumption, not a 5.4% assumption, because at some point there's a catch-up where you're in pretty good shape. So,
Yeah.
And you know, this is a subject that came up. It all comes down to the discounting. How much do we want to discount what we owe? The higher the discount rate, the more we're discounting it. If we look at it in pure dollars without a discount rate, we're somewhere between $3 and $4 billion that we owe as a city to our police and fire alone for the benefits that they've earned. And if we're looking at it realistically, that's the number. How much we choose to discount it is when you get into the actuarial assumptions and where we can then begin to take risk and put less in and get the risk of the market return, and this is where it gets really complex. But I think being very sober-minded about what we actually owe and then deciding what do we want the interest on our credit card to be if we don't make it. Do we want it to be 7 or do we want it to be 5.4? And that's where you start getting into risk and whether or not we want to be conservative about this and hard coding it. Even if you're paying more after 10 years, the reality has been you would have been paying enough, not too much, looking back. And that's with a period in the market that we've never seen before, where the Dow from 1982 through 2000 went from 1,000 to 15, 16,000. And that, I'm not sure, is likely to happen again. That was driven by baby boomers and a lot of other factors. And we're going to have, working against us during that same period, bonds had the best run they've ever had. Rates were coming down from 18% to 6%. So bond values increased incredibly. We don't have those winds behind us the next 20 or 30 years. So we need to be really fair about that discount rate. And that's balancing the interests of costs and benefits.
And we also need to balance the ability of the city to make Jacksonville a good place to live, because there are competing priorities. I heard that yesterday and before the council committee, so it really is a balance. Charlie? Or David was going to answer something first.
I was just going to say, we're all anxious to put, ground behind us and make progress, but I think it's a very fair question that you've asked about. And so one alternative, as opposed to just deciding today, is that we come back, the subcommittee comes back and says, look, we really have two choices. One is we use a 5.4% investment return assumption because we all feel like that's the safe place to be. Second choice, let's use the 7%, but let's make voluntarily higher payments and have a strategy for how we start to back off of those. And between those two choices, give us the pros and cons so that the task force has that summarized for us.
That's a good suggestion. Charlie?
I mean, that's really where I was, when we started this discussion, one of the concerns that dates back to the beginning of all these discussions, really, was the assumed rate of return within the fund itself. And I don't know if we were 8.5 or 8.25. That's come down over time, maybe 8.75. And I think the analysis that Pew gave us and the discussions we've had is that best practices historically have been, if you look at the Florida retirement system as an example, that you use that somewhere between 7.25, 7.5%. That was the range of discussions. Using 7%, I think, was the Civic Council recommendation, I believe. And unquestionably, using a 5.4% is more conservative. But we also know that if you did the calculation today of the unfunded liability at 5.4%, it wouldn't be the 1.7 or the 1.8. It's going to be $3.5 billion. I don't know what the number is. It's going to be some extraordinarily large number.
It's 2.5.
How much?
2.5.
2.5, okay, $2.5 billion, which is an extraordinarily large number. And so, my thought would be that we don't need to correct perhaps errors of the past by making further errors in the present. If we can commit to some increased amount of payment, whether that number, and I know that when I threw out the 210, I know that the chief of staff said that we're not sure that's the number, or the 120 wasn't sure it was the number, and I was using that as an example. To me, the objective is to come up with some additional amount that was affordable with the quality of life issues that the chairman just mentioned, and the objective would be to try to obtain, in my mind, it's 75 to 80% funding. And 5 years from now, 6 years from now, 10 years from now, we will then know what the investment return was for the previous 5, 7, or 10 years. And so if we've committed to a funding amount to achieve a targeted percent funded, 75 to 80%, if we can get to that number in 8 years because we had great returns, that's a great thing. If it takes us 10 years or if it takes us 12 years, but to use 5.4%, that just puts it much, much further out into the future. And I think we're penalizing the city too much, in my opinion, to use the 5.4. 7% would be considered, I think, on the cutting edge of being very conservative. I understand the science behind the 5.4, the 75% confidence that could be achieved, but the 7% is basically, we think over the long term, there's a 50% chance we're going to be above that and a 50% chance we'll be below that, so the 7% is sort of the median number. To me, I think we're taking too big of a bite to think that we should go anywhere below 7%. I think it's just going to cause too much of a financial issue to try to deal with it.
And I think that's where the subcommittee, as I heard it, ended up. Excuse me, that the 7% was really where I'm not sure John would agree, but well, he's young. But the 7% was probably where we ought to end up, and there ought to be an additional payment. They were calculating it as if you had a 5.4% rate, but that may not be how to do it. Maybe to figure out what's affordable. And so maybe, David, to your question, to ask the two different models, and for our purposes, let's say 80%. That seems to be what we've talked about all along, that maybe your subcommittee could meet between now and the next committee meeting, which is the 21st, and develop that, here's where we are either way, and make a recommendation.
Well, and here's the interesting thing is we're talking theoretically. The reality is if you look at the 5.4 as the discount rate with the 7% rate of return in comparison to the 7% discount rate with the 7% rate of return, If not adjusted for inflation, if looking at pure total dollars over 30 years, I believe the 5.4% discount rate with the 7% return is less cumulative dollars that the city has to pay because it is funding more today and getting an investment return. And that really is the key that we're all trying to get to. And so we can have two rates, which is in some ways confusing, or one rate and just get it right. And that is the issue. So if we're looking as a committee, are we looking at next year's cost or the next 30 years' cost? And we need to see that data point in order to look at that. But we really need to be thinking about the big picture, I think, as a task force, and then giving the city council an annual number that they can take home and know that that gets us there.
And keeping in mind, we've got a lot of other things in the city too. That's not to say that this isn't important, because it's very important. Some people have said this is the most important thing since consolidation, so we don't need to go back to the past. And I might just say something about the use of the word sins of the past. I think there are plenty of sins that go around. And so I forgot to say in my opening remarks that one of the real tasks we have is purely and simply reconciliation. We don't need to be bashing people, because I've learned, just as an example, John Keane has been bashed by a lot of people. I have learned over the last couple of months that John really is not the bad guy that people have portrayed him to be. And I really mean that. We have different perspectives. The city council and the mayor have a perspective. John's perspective is protecting the benefits of those police and fire. And so if the council or the mayor don't like what he's saying, they shouldn't shoot the messenger. It's really the message. And so we need to keep that in mind going forward, that there's plenty of sin to go around. And what we have a real opportunity to do is to reconcile the community to each other. This isn't just about numbers. And so I hope we'll keep that in mind. So, and part of that reconciliation is reconciling for the city council. How do we provide for a quality of life that's going to be attracting jobs into the community? So that's a little bit of a rant, but I feel very strident about that. Just another point that y'all talked about, which to those of us whose pay grade has been gone over by your work, y'all talked about, or Mr. DeZubi or David talked about using a closed system, I think it was called, of staggering the computation of the unfunded liability. In other words, you take each year and work that out. Would you explain that?
Yeah, yes, and we were learning on this too. So again, I'll defer if I get this wrong. But there was a question about amortization and what we think about that. And subcommittee, can you sort of clear the smoke out about this a little bit? And so there's really two methods that are practical for the city to consider. And it's dealing with the question of you make more, you make less in any one year than you thought you were going to make. So if you think you're going to make 7% and you have a big loss that year, how do you deal with it? And the practice is where we know things are going to go up and down, so you don't deal with it immediately all at once. You spread it over a period of time. There's two ways to spread it. One way is where everything is amortized as a separate layer for 30 years. That's not the method that the city is using. A second way is to say, by 2036, we only need to be fully funded. So everything is going to be amortized between now and 2036. So for the first year, you have 30 years. For the 10th year, you have 23 years. For the 20th year, you have 13 years or whatever. So what happens is you've boxed yourself in the late years to having very little time to recover from up and down volatility. So the point was, in terms of flexibility, using everything as 30-year layers, if you didn't have other considerations, that feels like a lot easier way to manage it. If you had a prejudice to believe, hey, losses aren't being dealt with quickly enough. In 2008, we lost a lot of money, and so we were fiddling while Rome was burning, you know. But that, in a 30-year amortization, you allow things to be dealt with over 30 years. We thought the right answer was, in a perfect world, you avoid the truncation that comes with the method that the city's doing, but your risk is you're not going to fund sufficiently. So if you voluntarily adopt a funding protocol that says, I'm going to put more money in up front, I'm not going to pay the minimum, you buy yourself the ability to have flexibility on the amortization approach, and so using the 30-year methodology for each layer was the right way to go. And we didn't put that in the subcommittee report. I made that in error, but that was the discussion we had on that point.
Great. I see Mr. DeZubi got up. Do you want to add anything to that? And we, again, are grateful for the help you've been giving to.
Robert DeZubi from Milliman. I just wanted to add one point. The different layer approach, which spreads each year out over 30 years, was used by the city pension, by the Police and Fire Pension Fund through the 2011 valuation report. It was only in the 2012 report where he put all the bases together and said they're all going to be paid by 23 years. Again, spreading them out, again, is probably what I was saying at the meeting, from intergenerational equity. You're spreading them out further, and each base is 30 years. They could be plus or minus. You get more of a ragged instead of a steady increasing.
I think everybody understands that now. I want to make sure we do. And as you had said at the subcommittee, that is permitted under Florida law.
It was through 11, and myself and Jim Lynn, the city council, talked with the Division of Retirement and asked if the city or the police and fire plan would be allowed to go back to the original method with the various bases, and they said they saw no reason why you could not.
Great. So y'all will need to add that as a recommendation the next time.
Right.
Greg is asking, what would that do to the unfunded liability? Yes, I don't think that changes.
No, I think it's just it's a payment methodology.
No, your unfunded, as of today, your unfunded liability would not be affected. In future years, because you're putting in more or less money, if you did comparisons, the unfunded liability would obviously differ. But as of today, it would not affect it.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, John.
There's a concept that's been introduced, I think today, in terms of the full task force, about 80% versus 100% being funded. Heretofore, all these data show fully funded at 100%. So I wonder if that's the sentiment of the task force, whether we ought not sort of put that as a point in time to say this is our sense of what our aim is, as opposed to 100% fully funded.
Sure. Okay, are y'all want to do that now? So let's, to get it on the floor, let's have somebody make a motion. So John, you want to make that motion?
Yeah, I would make the motion that the aim really is 80% in terms of the period of time.
Okay. Is there a second? Bill Rupp seconded. Discussion, John?
One thing to consider is, as we get to higher funding ratios, discussions about new benefits being added begin. Do we want to have a recommendation of a framework of the parameters for funding and everything that goes into the calculation to determine what new benefits would cost? Or do we want to leave it open to be just the way it has been in the past?
What I contemplated in the governance memo, I'm not sure it got articulated, was that the benefits don't change without the consent of both parties during the term of what remains of that agreement, which is 80% funded or whatever that fixed date is.
And so do we want to say, as a city, we are not going to be comfortable adding new benefits until we're actually at 90% funding, while 80% is the objective? Is that a healthy enough base to add new benefits? And then let's look at it from other perspectives. If certain parties are willing to reduce benefits for new employees today, and 20 years from now, why aren't those parties going to say, we were willing to reduce benefits to get to a higher funding ratio, now let's add benefits? So do we want to help set up a framework for what would be a healthy funding ratio to add new benefits, which was a big discussion going back on the transition team with the Payton administration. Their big issue, the Payton was explaining in terms of increasing the unfunded liability, was that when benefits are added, traditionally they're retroactive. They're for everybody. So they get a calculation, for example, that may be 2% each year they work, so 10 years as a 20% pension, increased to 3%, which is a dramatic cost impact when you add retroactive benefits. And so their recommendations included having a higher funding ratio when you add those new benefits, and I think that ought to be something that we think about.
Let's hold that till we talk about pension design going forward, because right now the question is, what's the level we want to see getting to funded. David Drain, I think, may have a perspective on this also.
Yeah, and I guess just two, so one, Florida law, as I understand it, mandates a target of 100%, and we think that, for all sort of benchmarking or setting targets, 100% is the right amount. What the liability is really fundamentally a measure of have we set aside enough money now to pay what we promised. And so for all these purposes, for setting funding targets for everything, 100% really is the right goal to be setting. And
I thought you were going to say that. Pew also has a perspective on this, and they'd like to see fully funded. Now, we have other things to balance out. So you've heard what that's it. Other discussion. Charlie? Charlie.
It would seem to me that the approach, I agree with the 80%, the motion on the floor. It seems to me the recommendation should be, and I understand why the 100% is the objective, but if we use the framework that's been discussed at the subcommittee, if we say what we really want to do is for the city to establish a minimum amount that they would pay over time, number one, which is what they were talking about here, and number two, to establish an additional amount. And the additional amount would be our recommendation is they have this additional amount that they would pay until it reaches 80% funding. I mean, to me, that's the way the recommendation could be structured. It's not contrary to the objective of 100%, but we're going to do the enhanced contribution until the 80% funding is obtained.
That's the way I understand it. Right. But the goal is to get 100% funded. But as John said, you don't want to go over. I don't think you do. But then you've over penalized those generations that have paid ahead. Greg Anderson wants to say something. I've observed him talking to Cindy, and I think the point is we're not talking now about pension design. We're talking about funding. And the other consequence of Judge Wallace's order is that to the extent pension design is subject to collective bargaining, then if there's an impasse, Greg and President Gulliford and others really need to be careful in what their positions are on pension design, because they ultimately will resolve the impasse. So with that in mind, Greg is going to be cautious and limited in his remarks.
Good morning. City's promised to come running up. Happy New Year, everyone. I am very encouraged by the level of discussion here. So, and I said that yesterday in all the committees that I attended, singing all of your praises, by the way. And I just want to peel back that a little bit so it'll make sense to you. If we come to impasse, which there is a good chance that we will, we just don't know. But if it comes to impasse, the City Council will sit as a quasi-judicial body, meaning we will take on the role as a judge. And if we do that, we have to hear the information that is presented to us in a trial, essentially, is the way that Cindy described it to us all about 1,000 times. And so I can't make any comments about pension design, anything that would be collectively bargained. Okay, so I'm going to try to create a hard line between those things that I can talk about and those things that I can't talk about. And so I couldn't talk about benefits, but I could talk about the idea of a less than 100% standard. And so all I'll say there is well, will I say anything, Cindy?
No, that's right, but as a group, as a whole, through the chairman, we're not talking about modifying the pension plan of the individuals, because that's when you need to have two people in a chair discussing it. So that's why I wanted to caution everybody in addition to the council member.
So given the fact that, as Council President Gulliford indicated, sort of political realities, I would at least like for us to look at alternatives that may include 100%, but may include something less than 100%. And so the idea of an 80% funding target will be something that I think we ought to look at as well. Thank you.
So that I understand, if we adopt, let's say we pass this motion, what you're saying is you'd still like to see David Drain, for example, model what would the difference would be at 100%?
I've only, thank you, Mr. Chairman, I have observed through my vast 2.5 years of experience on the city council that the council works best when we present options to them. They want, and so if you give them more than one option, they tend to, that tends to give them more maneuverability. And so my recommendation is, rather than sort of choosing one option, one of the ways to get around it is to give them a couple options. And that allows us to do what I think everybody was trying to do.
So are you suggesting then that this task force not take a position, but produce an alternative?
I would suggest that one of the ways to approach it would be to present multiple solutions, which would then have financial ramifications. So, for example, a 5.4% assumed rate of return spread out over whatever period we choose has a very substantial impact to the city's budget. An 80% assumed rate of return at 7% has another impact to the budget. But at the end of the day, you're going to come up with a bogey. You're going to come up with a $50 million number that we've got to find a way to fund. So I think the next discussion, and the one that'll generate some real interesting conversation, is how do we fix that bogey? How do we get to it?
Where are the revenues?
Yeah, that's right.
The chair is a little in doubt. I'm thinking I still think we ought to adopt the target and then ask, as we present it, we ought to say, here's the alternative at 100%. But I'm happy to do whatever y'all want to do. But it seems to me that so that we can move on, we ought to adopt it one way or the other.
The spirit of that flexibility, if we said one of the options is 100%. Another option is doing the bogey up to 80% and then relook at your option. And I think that's what we're talking about here.
Okay. So that's the motion is to provide both of those models at 80 and 100. Okay?
This is as it speaks to funding.
As it speaks to funding. Right. Okay. All right, we'll take that as an amendment to the motion. Is there any other discussion? And
I was just going to, if I could offer just 2 points.
Sure.
I think Charlie's question was helpful, and it makes two things about the general direction about 5.4 and what we're trying to bite off. So as we think about the question of what we want to do on an actuarial analysis, and to the extent those are publicly reported data, we do significantly overstate liabilities publicly beyond what we think they really are if we looked at a real expectation. To the extent we also say, well, we're talking about an additional funding amount, maybe it's not 30 million over or 20 million over 190. So 190 to 210, maybe we can't afford 20 million, it's only 10. The danger of that thinking is we proceed with a payment schedule that, in the definition that the subcommittee used, may not be affordable. We're saying we can really only afford a plan that we can pay off if we only earn something with 75% confidence. And so using the 5.4 assumption for purposes of sizing what we can really pay, we thought was very helpful in terms of a discipline of what are we signing up for and how do we know we can afford it. So we thought it was the essence of affordability to have that kind of an expectation.
And whatever that number ends up being, we'll come back to,
right,
as you suggested, over the next couple of minutes. Right. Okay. So are y'all ready to vote?
Can you just restate the motion so we don't clearly get it?
ready to try, but I'm not sure I'll get it right. The motion is that we adopt a recommendation for now that includes a scenario where we contractually bind ourselves to getting to, on one hand, an 80% funded ratio, and on the other, a 100% funded ratio. Now, we may come back and make a further recommendation if the council ought to do one or the other, but for now, that's what we want to say. Is that fair? Ready to vote? Owen, push the button.
You're asking for
I've always-
a vote or a request for analysis?
Yeah, I think it's a request for analysis at this
Is that
point,
it? Okay, is that
isn't
what, okay. David, can you do those? Jim is coming up. Yep.
I'm just going to reiterate what has been said before, which is getting to 100% funded ratio is a legal requirement. It's not an option. I mean, that's the legal requirement. Obviously, the task force could recommend that the city have a target of an 80% funded ratio for purposes of an additional funding requirement over the required funding in accordance with the law. That certainly is within your purview, but to treat 80% versus 100% as two different options, you're still legally required to submit
We get that.
reports
Yeah, we get that, but it's
showing that
yes,
you're going to
it's-
hit the 100%
But it's for the purpose of binding the city councils of future years to an extra payment, which is beyond what's actuarially you're required to get to the 100%. Understood?
Right.
But for that extra, so that we can enter into an agreement with the pension fund, that for this period of time, we will contribute this extra amount until we get to 80%, and then we'll reconsider.
Mr. Chairman, begging your pardon for just a moment. So first, you would have, of course, the recognition that the city will continue to pay the actuarial assessment from the police and fire pension fund. And that's where everybody's talked that it's really around 7%. So that's clear, and I think that's confirmed.
That's the percentage of 120 that goes to the normal cost.
That's the law. That's the law. That's when the actuary says, this is how much you have to pay, and that's the assumption they're using. So that, I think, a confirmation is helpful to the 19 elected officials who haven't been living in this. This is what you must do. You must pay the request, the amount sent over from the actuary from the police and fire pension fund.
Sure.
Right, there's a process if they go off the rocks, but it's really hardly.
And that's based on 100%.
Yes, that's based on state law. The actuary says, I think the return is going to be 7%, and so your payment this year under that is X, and you must pay that under state law.
Sure.
And I will
And so
bore you with the nuances.
So, okay, so that on the funding, maybe we bifurcate the motion, and we say we would agree two parts. One, to pay, the city will continue to pay the legally required actuarially determined amount. And number two, we will pay
An additional amount as
based on reaching alternatively either an 80% funded or a 100% funded.
Or just paying it down the debt faster over a period of years, however you want to phrase that. It's the second concept is making an additional payment.
Correct.
Now, the third thing is I'm going to recommend that this is not a contractual obligation for 19 elected officials to a board that's set up under state law. The only contractual obligation between the city and the police and fire pension fund is to pay the annual amount identified by their actuary.
Sure.
There are methods over the years we've used to to emphasize from one council to another the need to do things. And part of what we're found to do, one example was with JTA funding certain mass transit when we had BJP, was a resolution of the council that each year they go through a certain process with the goal of contributing additional funds for the overall benefit of the city in the amount of X, Y, whatever you want to put in. And it makes them actually see the math and see that this is better to pay down the debt. But that would be the recommendation. But a contractual obligation from the elected officials, they have to each year balance what they have to do under the law with what they need to do. And that constraint from now going forward is something that if binding makes it extremely difficult to weigh that. So the resolution forcing them to look at the math, to see the benefit, all of that, we have found over the years has really worked.
I know you feel that way because we ought not bind ourselves to the fund, but I will tell you that there is a very good sense that I'm not trying to cast any sins here. What I'm trying to say is holding the public officials' feet to the fire is very important. And if that's just going to be every year they get together and reanalyze, I'm not sure that's where the task force is. But that ultimately will come out in the way we structure the government.
It's extremely important, but they do have to balance, they have more on their plate every day, than the pension, and some legal obligations with regard to how they can bind themselves to spend funds. They have bond obligations and things like that, so that now if they took on an additional contractual obligation, that could have really even a negative effect. You'd have to look at that analysis. On their other obligations, like let's say they contracted to pay $500 million a year, you could see you'd have to disclose that, and it might affect your rate and ultimately cost you more. So this is the analysis that the council has to do in passing a $1 billion budget every year. So I just point that out.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And I just want to make sure we get clarification on this point. So I guess Mr. DeZubi, I'm not sure who would make this. In your analysis, has there ever been a time that the city has not provided the 100% funding to the pension plan? Who can answer that question? I don't.
I think the answer is they always have.
Well,
let me just
clarify that. Yeah, because I don't want this conversation to think like the council's not ponying up. Yeah.
Well, that was never the question.
Right.
The question was around the unfunded liability.
Right. And it wasn't
Everybody
enough.
understands you've got to pay the obligation. We're not at 80%. We're less than 40%. So that's what we're trying to address. Is the aim 80% instead of 39%, which is where we are, or is it 100%? And when you do 5.4% and you add mortality tables, those numbers get really, really big, and then you've got to deal with the city council about, so how are we going to apportion what level of funding to pension versus the other needs of the city?
Bill, and then
Mr. Chairman, just so in my mind, what we're saying is we need to be 100% funded. We are saying we're going to come up with some mechanism to put in extra money until we get up to 80% funded. That's what's being asked here. And then at 80%, the powers that be can decide if they're going to keep putting in extra or back it down or whatever.
that's the way I understand it. With the footnote that we've asked to see what that would be, the effect at a 100% and at 80%. Right. Tad?
Yeah, and I think the question was, has the council or the administration ever failed to make the contributions required by the actuary? And the answer is no to that. But what did happen and what has historically happened, and I think we need to be aware of this and we need to do this in our recommendations, is there have been years in which the administration and council said, in lieu of actually paying money into the fund, we're going to take the excess earnings of the fund and we're going to apply those excess earnings to the city's obligation. And there, if you look at the JCCI study, there was approximately $100 million in such funds taken from the pension fund's reserves, which is a net loss of $200 million because that was $100 million taken out and $100 million not placed in. So I think there is a need. I mean, I know we don't want to get into the past sins, but unfortunately, it seems the only past sins that have been discussed are
judgment comes despite reconciliation.
but are the pension. And in truth, there's a lot of past sins to go around. And part of that is the way that funding was handled in the past, and I think we need to be aware of that in our recommendations.
Sure. Charlie, and then John.
It seems to me that the way to structure this properly for our recommendation to council would be first to state that, and everybody's seen the chart, and I think city council knows this, but to state somewhat the obvious, that we recommend that the legally required contributions over the next period of time, let's say to 2036, we believe results in a unachievable or unaffordable obligation of the city. Therefore, it's the recommendation of this task force that the city provide contributions in excess of that minimum required amount in order to avoid contributions in the future that we believe would not be sustainable or affordable. And so the recommendation is that we develop an additional funding plan where additional funds are contributed in excess of the required minimum, at least until achieve 80% funding or 100% funding, at which then it falls back to the normal required contribution. I mean, to me, that's the way the recommendation is somewhere.
We'll work out the specific language, but that's the intent of the resolution, as I understand it.
And I think that the task force as a whole doesn't have the benefit of all of the information from the subcommittee meetings. There are two charts that Pew put together for us, I believe, on Friday that I think would really help all of us to take a look at. One is if we were going to take the entire unfunded liability and pay it levelly, a level load over, I think, 20 or 30 years, it was $190 million, something like that per year. I think looking at that would be helpful. And then there was another one that compared the discount rates of the 7 and the 5.4. I think there's a misconception about the long-term impact of the 5.4. And what we saw was that on an inflation-adjusted basis, after about 10 or 15 years, the cost started to continually go down for the city, whereas in 10 to 15 years on the 7% discount rate, they continued to increase. So essentially, the 5.4 looked identical to the level loading. And I think that looking at those two charts, I think were very helpful. What we really wanted, and we didn't get today, was to say, take out the inflation adjustment, because we don't know that revenues are going to grow with inflation. They haven't the last 10 years because of real estate prices. So let's look at this in nominal dollars of what happens to the costs. And I think as a group we need to see that, because I'd hate for us to vote and make decisions without the full information. And so as a subcommittee, I think we tried to take our task and say, okay, here's our recommendations, and it's valid to question those recommendations. I think you ought to know the data that went into that.
Well, what I want to propose is that we adopt it, that we then write the language up with this intent, and we come back and ratify that at our next meeting so that we can discuss that. That's what I'd like to propose. Are you all ready to vote? All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed. And I will try to write that up. And my sense is that, and I guess the general counsel and the finance, the CFO, Chief Financial Officer, can help us in figuring out a way that, because I'm sensing that we want to bind our city leadership, that we can't just have this every year sort of where we're going to decide what we're going to do. That's what we need to be disciplined, I guess is the word. So, and the flip side of this is that from the perspective of the fund, if we commit to making these are significant additional dollars, and so for that, we should be entitled to additional governance responsibilities. So that's all part of this complex deal that we're trying to come up with.
So when we talk about paying more, I mean the practical decisions to be made, remember our base case is, without doing anything, we start at 140 and we go to 400. Right. 480. 480. So the first choice is, do we want to adopt a more level payment structure? Just adopting a level payment structure and doing nothing extra sort of moves you from the 140 to 190. Then there's a question that says, okay, but you know what, investment returns, do we want to count on a safer return structure so that we're paying as though we're planning for a reasonable expectation, but we're hoping for something better. And that's an even greater amount that takes you from the 190 to 210 or 220. And so when we talk about paying more, it's those two decisions that the task force has to make. And the subcommittee's recommendation was go for a level payment structure because we don't know that tomorrow will be better than today. Right. And secondly, pay more than what you would have to pay by just assuming 7%, assume a lower rate of return. Those were the two specific recommendations that the subcommittees made.
That's right, and that's what we're going to ponder over the next couple of weeks, so that coming back, that's going to be, and when we come back, we will also have some additional proposals to consider, so at the end of the day, we can put together a package that makes it so. Okay, I think we've taken action on that. Is there anything else we need to do, David, with what your subcommittee has recommended? Do y'all need to meet in between?
We have the practical matter of how do we define the schedules that the task force might want to see. So that, how do we vet that? I don't
So
know.
y'all, with the sunshine law, y'all will need to have a meeting because you can't call up each other and talk to each other. And David Drain and Jonathan will be available either to come or to talk on the phone or to help with that. So, and again, we just can't say enough thanks to Pew. We wouldn't be able to be here without y'all. Okay, let's take it's 10:30, let's take a 10-minute break. Come back and we'll talk about the program.
I feel bad, it's so difficult to discuss.
Been there, done a lot of that, so.
Thank you for doing this.
This is because I can't see that.
Keep throwing obstacles up, but hey, that just means we gotta, swerve a little bit. Good to see you, man.
Well, yeah, and I also, money
All right, let's come back together.
See, I suspect.
Thank y'all. What is on the board right now is the chart that John talked about, and we're not going to spend any time on it, but just so that you can realize the difference. What John was pointing out is if you use the 5.4 rate, it starts out higher, that's the green line, but ultimately over the term out to 2036, your exposure, your funding actually goes down. So maybe what we can do is print that, Carol, and email it to the task force so that we have it.
And one thing to bear in mind is this is inflation adjusted, so a couple things impact this. The blue line gets a lot higher, 480 million is the peak. And the green line would also be somewhat higher, more flat. But cumulative total annual payments through 2044, what is going to be most beneficial to the city in terms of total cost is the question, total actual dollars, because we can't be certain real estate prices will increase at 2.5%, which is the assumption here that the tax rate will increase and these costs will go down.
Okay, thank you. I would like to turn now to the governance issues. And again, I'm not looking for any sort of vote today, but I just wanted to lead you through my thinking. And I do want to say and thank John Keene and President Gulliford and the mayor and Chris and Cindy and Ronnie, because all of them had, I think I named everybody, that has had a lot of input on this. And that's not to say that we have an agreement on this, but it does mean that there's been a lot of thought behind it on what the pressure points are on what is doable. My goal being, and I hope your goal, is not to have this be something we do that's nice and pretty that ends up sitting around forever. What I intend is we be hard-hitting and have recommendations that are going to go from here to the council. And as you'll recall, the way this is structured, our recommendations on funding, on the unfunded liability, and on governance and investment authority, I believe those can go straight to the mayor and council and fund the governing bodies for action, and the pension design would be in the form of recommendations that would go to the city as a negotiating position. That's the way I read the law. So we've had a lot of help on this, but I didn't mention Jim Lynn has been also very helpful. So just going through it, taking the recommendations one at a time. The first, which y'all came through loud and strong, is on a professionalized financial investment advisory committee. Jonathan Trichter has been insistent that this be beyond an investment advisory committee, that it also have some financial responsibilities, so that the 5 trustees of the fund have the benefit of some experienced professionals in the field. That's not to say that the fund trustees aren't wise and all of that, but just like boards that we're on, UNF, Community Foundation, Columbia Seminary, we rely on professionals for these types of things. So y'all have been very strong about that. You'll see that what it recommends is that the members of that committee have certain qualifications. They have terms limited to three-year terms, that they are appointed by the fund's board of trustees, but require confirmation by the city council, because if the city is going to fund and hold everybody accountable, and actually the fund is part of the overall city, then that gives the city council some say. I will say that John Keene's fear about that is that sometimes before the Rules Committee, nominations get politicized for one reason or another. Well, that's a sin of the past, and we will just hope the council doesn't do that in the future. But the council does need some oversight. Let me get through number one. And then it allocates to the committee certain powers which are stronger in parts of evaluating money managers and financial consultants, but not in others. Discussion, well, let me get through it, and then, because they interrelate. This then relates, if you go over to paragraph number 4, and this really is, how do you 4 and 5, how do you select your fund board members? We had a lot of discussion about, and President Gulliford had a lot of discussion, and there is now pending a bill to go to the legislature or to the council with a referendum to change the selection of the third trustee to the council. This takes a different view as a trade-off, because it's my judgment that we'll be in litigation over that, that if we can accomplish essentially the same thing by having a strong investment in the Financial Advisory Committee, we do that. So what 4 and 5 say is that we do think that fund board members should be subject to term limits. What I have suggested is that there be 3 terms of 4 years or 12 years. That's longer than the investment committee, and that's the way the Community Foundation's board members are. It just gives a little more time for them to understand and act on a very complicated area. And then the qualifications specifically for the 3 council-appointed trustees incorporate some community wisdom, that sort of thing. The statute delineates the qualifications for the police trustee and the fire trustee, and that is that they be elected by the police and fire. And I don't know that statutorily we can impose any additional requirements. We might be able to, but I don't think we need to go there. So then that's why those are worded like they are, or proposed like they are. Paragraph 2 talks about ethics and disclosure requirements, which are pretty self-explanatory. I think John Keene would say that they do a lot of this already. In fact, I think part of this came from John to my initial draft. So they are already doing a lot of this. Number 3, the Office of General Counsel. As we've discussed before, the charter provides that the opinions of the General Counsel are binding on all of the member parts of the city, be they the mayor, the council, independent boards and agencies. The Police and Fire Pension Fund takes the position that Article 22 of the charter, which is what creates them, there's a section in there that says anything in the charter that is inconsistent with Article 22 is repealed. Now, I'm not saying whether that's right or not, but that's their position. So they have said that, well, they're not necessarily subject to the same rulings of the General Counsel because they have the right to employ their own counsel. I'm not going to argue the point, I'm just pointing it out. But it seems to me that in terms of our governance, in return for forcing the city to comply with its obligations, that we're entitled to ask some recognition of the general structure of the city. It does provide that, and it's true that the pension fund does need competent, quality advice on pension work. There's no question about it. I entered into this whole thing with a real cynical view about the current special counsel for the fund. South Florida lawyer, high rates. Why are we doing that? Well, it turns out that Bob Klausner's rate is $250 an hour. That's about half of what Tad's and Kirsten's rates are, which is very, I have to say, those are reasonable. $250 an hour for a senior, nationally respected lawyer is well in line. Plus, Bob and I have had some meetings. He knows what he's doing. He wants the welfare of the city as a whole. Cindy has confidence in him. So what I've provided is that we recognize the need for that advice, and that we recognize that Bob's firm going forward is important. We do say that generally the fund would rely on the general counsel's office, which I think they're willing to do. But if they need more specialized legal counsel, they ought to be able to do that. The protection is that they have to have 4 of their 5 trustees agree to that. And then the general counsel would have to approve whoever that counsel was and what the fee structure was. I'm reasonably confident that John is not willing to agree to that yet, but I'll beat him over the head until he does. That's something to be negotiated. Going over to paragraph 6, this really picks up from the subcommittee and from Pew what the requirements would be for actuarial standards, transparency, and disclosure. I think this is mostly being done as far as the actuarial stuff, but in terms of the annual actuarial reports and that sort of thing, I think that the fund has started doing that, but those are the types of recommendations that this covers. Section 7 deals with the selection of the future administrator when John retires, and this essentially picks up what the mediated settlement does. It adds a few other things, but that's essentially what had already been agreed to. Paragraph 8, the future administration of the fund. The second half of that deals with what the mediated settlement agreement did, and that has to do with the closure of the special retirement fund for senior management. And what that does is pick that up as of the end of this fiscal year, because everybody's made plans based on this year and they're in the budgets. And that assumes that John wouldn't retire before then, but he might decide to do that. I'm just teasing you, John. It does say that when you get the next administrator, from that point, the compensation of that person will be determined by a market analysis of comparably sized pension plans. Right now, as y'all recall, the compensation of the administrator is the average of the compensation of the CEOs of the other independent agencies, which I think most of us felt that was on the high side. So this deals with that. Number 9 is the status of the 30-year agreement. The first part of that is that it proposes that you either amend and restate the existing 30-year agreement, or you come up with a new agreement. And the reason for the new agreement is that Judge Wallace's order casts some doubt. He implies, but he doesn't come out and say, that the 30-year agreement, since it was also negotiated, quote, outside of the sunshine, that its vitality may be in question. So to avoid another suit by the newspaper, for example, that the whole 30-year agreement is invalid, if we have a new agreement that accomplishes what we want to do, then we don't run that risk, because we've done it in sunshine. Plus, it doesn't deal with pension benefits. That goes to collective bargaining. So the 30-year agreement really does become an agreement on fund administration, governance, funding the liability and the obligations, but not on pension design. This tracks the 80% ratio that we may or may not end up at. That's what this says. It does also provide one thing that John was concerned about. People will agree or disagree, but he wants to make sure that someone in a judicial setting is monitoring the performance. He said of the city, but it's really of both parties. So what this proposes is that we continue, we don't continue it, but the parties continue the federal case, and that we ask Judge Howard to appoint Judge Schlesinger as a master over the course of the term of the agreement to make sure both parties are compliant with it. I've talked to Judge Schlesinger. He is very excited to be asked to be doing this. He's agreed to do it. He also is a senior district judge, so he agrees that there are no fees. So we have a master that's already getting paid by his pension. So this doesn't cost us anything. I think Harvey brings a lot of community respect. Both John and the city have agreed to this in concept. I don't want to say they've agreed to the particulars, but that has been agreed to. Number 10 is return to collective bargaining. What this initially said was that we would do this at the end of the shortened 30-year agreement, but given Judge Wallace's order, it seems to me we need to go to that now. So it's the pension design that goes now. Then paragraph 11 is consultation, which pretty much picks up what the mediated agreement said. It talks in terms of people working together. And then 12 talks about codifying this. Investment authority, I did have in here the investment authority as reflected by the bill that's before the council, which is expanding the investment authority. But I got so confused about what was before the council yesterday that I don't know what the bill says. So I just decided we'll just leave that, we'll add it when we get it, and somebody can concisely say what that is, that'll go in here, and then we'll debate it. What I'm advised is that at least the Rules Committee approved expanding the investment authority but deleting the hedge funds after some discussion. So they've agreed to defer that bill until we conclude our work. Two committees deferred. So I think that's really where we are. What this contemplates is that we would then add to this your committee's work dealing with the unfunded liability, and then we would separate out, still go in as a recommendation, but it'd take a different form as far as pension. So that's where we are. Again, I'm not looking for decisions on this, but this is really for discussion. So the floor is now open. Ted?
Yeah, one of the things, and I think this is a very good start, I'm glad you put this together, and has a lot of very good ideas. It's a lot of hard work, obviously, that's put into this by a lot of people. One of the things that I think has been sort of hampering us is that the pension and the unions have been relying upon the 30-year agreement at this point, and not, and it's been a little bit difficult for us to get into this process because we're not sure what can be negotiated and what can't be negotiated. And I think when Mr. Shaw was making comments earlier, I think he's right. We don't need to be putting people in corners. We don't need to be threatening them. We don't need to be pushing agendas that are, designed to harm their interest or whatever. We're looking towards the same thing, which is a long-term viability of this pension plan and a process that will let us come up with good solutions. I don't know what is going to happen with a 30-year agreement, one way or the other. One of the things that I would suggest, though, is that to the extent we're talking about the collective bargaining process, if we're coming up with we may want to consider coming up with a recommended mechanism for the collective bargaining process to take place. Because right now, what we have is we have the FOP representing two different units. We have the firefighters representing two different units. We have some employees are not in any of those units, and they're all part of the employees represented by the police and fire pension. I think it harms the credibility of the pension for the pension to be essentially negotiating or talking about increases or changes in benefits. I've always felt that way. At the same time, I think there needs to be some entity or organization to permit, if there is going to be collective bargaining as to pension benefits or changes. Maybe another entity that could be voted on by the members or something that could represent them in these negotiations or any suggested changes. And the reason I think that would be important is because when we're looking at this, I have no doubt that changes in benefits and everything else were done in good faith, and everybody's trying to come up with a good plan. But now when we look at this, we're going, well, why isn't that a conflict of interest between the pension trying to govern its funds and at the same time try to get more benefits? I don't know whether it is or it isn't, but it sort of looks to people on the outside like it was. And I think just to be able to, to the extent there is going to be collective bargaining on these issues, and I don't know whether there is or isn't, that's still waited to be decided with regard to the 30-year agreement. It would seem to me that a useful thing that we could do is maybe suggest some mechanism to permit that to take place.
That's a good idea. And what I'm going to ask you to do then, Mr. Volunteer, is if you will get with the General Counsel and with Mr. Lynn and with Mr. Foster and Mr. Key, you can...
Can I do that?
I'm not sure. Well, Cindy, since that's a mechanism of collective bargaining, that's a governance issue. That's not really designing the pension. So can he talk to John or Bob Costner?
Let me answer it this way. Collective bargaining is an entire separate area of law with which Tad's quite familiar. And it may appear awkward, but the way it works is, despite anything in Judge Wallace's order, the way it works is under Florida law, the CEO, the mayor, designates somebody. That person sits down with who is the actual bargaining agent elected by people. They're elected, so you can't just move them out and say it's somebody else. And then you negotiate it. And yes, there are 4 unions. Typically, the government, and the best example is FRS, because FRS has over 900 unions that they have to deal with. They don't sit down and negotiate with 900 people. They decide what they think is best, and then they come and they bargain in good faith and don't really move. And so that's why you have FRS only moving about every 10 years. There is no substitute under Florida law for the city of Jacksonville's designee from the mayor's office sitting down with the elected agent from each of those 4 units and reaching an agreement. The only way to avoid that is by having each of those unions waive their right. And then it is up to them to decide who they want to negotiate on their part. We as a city can't choose who should be negotiating on behalf of those unions. They have the right to waive, they have the right to hire counsel and say one counsel, all of us get together and do it. But that's really their province is how I see the law.
Okay. So that means we can't take a statutory amendment. So let me ask you this.
What we could do is we could set up a system that under which the unions could designate or agree that the persons elected by them could serve.
As they're negotiating.
As they're
They do it all the
bargaining.
Right, which they can do on their own. I don't think the city should be telling the unions who.
So let me just do this, Tad. I'm going to ask you to further articulate what you made with Cindy and with Jim Lynn. My question, though, was can he talk to Bob Costner and John Keene about this issue?
No, I think that goes to the heart of collective bargaining, so I would, without getting a clarification, I would advise them not to.
So we can't get any input except in a public setting. So, John, we're not trying
that's a safer course.
to exclude you, but we were forced to do that. So, but I'm sure Cindy's and Jim's and Tad's vast experience will take that into account.
Yes.
Okay. So, all right. Other questions? Charlie?
Ted, I think you did a great job on trying to pull all these concepts together. I've got some, fairly detailed comments, but not of any great significance. In paragraph 1, the top of page 2, where you're trying to stagger the terms.
Yep.
Having a person appointed for 1 year, I'm not sure they will know much about it at the end of 1 year. That doesn't seem to be fair for the person with a 1-year term. I would suggest you have one person serve a 4-year term, and then everything else works.
Okay.
I think 1 year is a little bit too short for it. Who wants to do it for 1 year, just try to figure out what's going on? Then
Well, the
it'd be off.
implication is that they would be reelected. So anyway, but that's a good point. Okay. All right. Yep.
Similarly, on paragraph 4, my reaction to being able to serve 3 consecutive 4-year terms, 12 years is a long time. It seems to me 2 consecutive 4-year terms would be adequate as opposed to 3. That's just my reaction to that. I appreciate the sensitivity of paragraph 5. I would suggest as a possibility, my gut tells me, and I've not been obviously involved in any of the conversations, and I'm not probably familiar with all the nuances of the importance of this, but if in fact it goes to collective bargaining, the 5th member of the fund may be less important than perhaps it has been in the past, if you put into a collective bargaining environment. But another potential way on the 5th trustee, and this gets back to the issue you spoke about earlier of trying to somewhat commit people to something. What about the possibility if we were to achieve this, and I always keep saying 75%, everybody else always says 80%. What if we were to tie the appointment of the 5th member going to city council once a fill in the blank, 75, 80% funding is achieved? In other words, they don't get the right to do that until they've stepped up to the plate and put the money in there where it needs to go. As a possible way, in addition to what you define here to say, upon achieving 75, 80% funding, then that 5th member appointment, once the city council, as the elected representatives have put that money in and got it where it needs to be, on the right track, 80%, we know it's got to be 100%, but has it on the right track, then and only then do they get the right to appoint the 5th member.
Well, why have they lost their right to get the 5th member today? Has the city council?
Because
Well, I understand the statute, but I think the question is in effect, you're saying when the city funds it properly, then the city council gets the ability to appoint someone. Why wouldn't they for the 20? What does that have to do with the proper governance over the next 20 years?
I was just trying to come up with a mechanism to get the 5th member, as opposed to the way it's written now.
My sense was, and John, I hope will speak to this when he's going to address this in a little bit, that both Randy Wise and John had said that was a real problem for them. So my thought was, and I tend to seek common ground. If you have a strong investment committee and you have the standards there, then the need for that goes down. And so, Kirsten and then Ted.
With respect to paragraph 5, I just want to have a question clarifying what the recommendation is. Just because of the language, and that it's probably my error in reading it. Is the recommendation, certainly that recommendation is not that all of the trustees be appointed by the council. You're just saying that the 5th be appointed by the council.
Yeah, the 2 current
first
ones
2.
and the 5th trustee that's elected, appointed by the 4th.
So all 3 of those should have these criteria.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
And with respect to the appointment of the 5th by the council, I think it kind of comes back to this tension that we've been dancing around with in a lot of these issues is, who do the trustees owe their fiduciary duty to? Do they owe it to the members of the fund and the beneficiaries and the dependents in the fund, or beneficiaries, or do they owe it to the city and to the council? And I think you also have that issue when you talk about who is the counsel to the fund, whether it's the Office of General Counsel or they have their own counsel. And I think those are hard questions. I know in the Taft-Hartley context, when you have private employers and labor unions, those funds are managed by an equal number of union side trustees and an equal number of employer side trustees. And typically, there is fund counsel for both sets of those trustees. And so, because it's in those contexts, it's very clear that the fiduciary duty is owed to the participants of the fund, not to the people who are, funding it, but the participants. So I think we might need to I'd like to hear from Mr. Keene about that, and I think that we need to be really clear about who is the fiduciary duty owed to.
And in the governance memo, it's the statute provides, and the charter, maybe it's the statute, provides that the fiduciary duty is owed to the fund, not to the funder. And so what we were trying to get at was the feeling of the committee that since the city is funding it, there ought to be more responsibility directed toward them. So that is definitely, you put your finger right on the heart of the issue. Other questions? John?
One thought was if the trustees are appointing or nominating candidates for the investment committee and the city council is ratifying that, and the concern is that becomes politicized, why not reverse it, have city council nominate and let the trustees confirm?
I'd like to hear what John had to say about that. It basically goes back to the fiduciary responsibility there, because if I'm the board, it's even though I've delegated to the investment committee this responsibility, I can't, by delegating it, take away my own fiduciary. So it seems to me legally, it ought to flow from the board and have it confirmed by the council. You screw up the fiduciary responsibility of it. That's why. Okay?
Yeah, I look at this as, I personally don't think this is all that important, who's the fifth trustee. I think there's actually an obligation that's set up in the charter, and they do have fiduciary responsibilities to the members of the fund. I think, though, this is a big political issue with the policemen and police officers and firefighters. And I don't think it's going to matter one way or the other. I think there is a concern that there is somewhat of an attack on them and their benefits, and I think this is maybe one of those issues that perhaps I think we need to be cognizant of, and we need to be able to say, listen, if the management of the fund, I mean the control of the pension fund and everything else, we're giving good advice. We're not doubting that they have good intentions, that they are, I do believe that we need to assist in creating some other mechanisms so that they're not as involved in some of the political dealings in terms of the council and that type of thing. I think that would be healthy for the fund.
Yeah.
But I don't think this is a big deal.
Okay. And you do also have the added layer of Judge Schlesinger during this period of time.
That's true, too.
John?
As it relates to sunshine laws, if there was a delegate selected by the unions to negotiate the benefits, would they be required by law to have meetings with the trustees and the administrator of the pension fund in the sunshine to discuss pension benefits?
See, I think that the fund would not have any role in the benefits at that point. It'd be purely collective bargaining between the unions and the city. Okay, other questions? David?
And I don't want to hold us up with discussion, but I'll just make some points, and you can maybe, on the topic of the Investment Advisory Committee members, will they be named as fiduciaries? Maybe they are fiduciaries or they're not. Will they be named as fiduciaries was a question. I know you haven't taken training. Secondly, should there be considerations of those volunteers being from a pool beyond just those who live in Duval County? And is it possible to broaden that group to include the metropolitan statistical area and or those who work in the city in order to get a bigger group of folks in investment advisory?
Yep.
On the investment managers, and when you get into the good practices of disclosures and conflicts, should investment managers have to disclose any relationships, business relationships they may have with any of the investment advisory committees. So if you had a fund manager that was a brother, or you had an owner of property that, somehow is working its way into the fund that has a connection. So the relationship between fund managers and members of the investment advisory committee, or family members of the investment advisory committee. On the actual and financial reporting matters, which I thought was very comprehensive, I just had a question: is 60 days really realistic? That seems like a pretty tight time frame, but maybe that's adequate.
You're on paragraph 6.
Yep, the paragraph.
Page 5.
The paragraph, 6J.
6J.
Where you have,
Well, above 6J.
Yeah, 60 days.
Yep.
And then when you get into 6J, a whole second set of financial statements seems pretty onerous, the two different sets of assumptions. So maybe it's really just their selected schedules, maybe combining K and M to be a list of selected questions that want to be answered, as opposed to preparing two sets of financial statements, which seem to me it could be really the careful we ask for.
Let's stop here, because this really came from Pew. Okay, David Drain added that. I think that was for comparison. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, and I would agree with David's point that all these can be combined in one document. There's no need for a bunch of separate documents that do things different ways, but additional exhibits within that financial statement that both show under an alternative set of assumptions to show, the risk on, ideally in both ways, not only the downside risk, but the upside risk. What do costs look like if things overperform? And then those 30-year projections, so that, people looking at this have a sense of not only what does the current year hold, but what does the future hold. So it could be all in one document.
With David, I know you got other stuff to do, but I'm not capable of doing that.
Yeah, no, I think it would be simply three things. The alternative items presented, subject to any recommendation by Pew, would be the valuation of the liabilities at the two discount rates, the contributions that would be required under those two different sets of assumptions, the high return, low return, and maybe the normal cost, if there's a normal cost angle in there. Those three things, I think, would give you a pretty robust consideration of another outcome.
Okay, right.
And that's all I have.
Okay. Thank you. Others? Ready to vote?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Most of those have been covered. Most of my comments have been covered already, so I will go quickly. Just to point out on page 2, the investment committee essentially will have only advisory sort of responsibilities, that the power to choose investment options or not will remain with the Police and Fire Pension Board, and that's your intent, is that correct?
Yes, because that's where the fiduciary is responsible.
Okay. And really the only new standard here is if the Police and Fire Pension Fund says, I'm not going to do that, then they've got to tell us why. Do I read that correctly?
Tell me what paragraph.
Well, it's on page 2. Let's see, a rejection of, and then paragraph 3 on page 2. I think I read it, a rejection of a particular recommendation by majority of the vote. Let's see, if the recommendation, I think I read it here this morning over coffee, that if the recommendation is positive, then they can take the final action, but if it's negative, there has to be...
It's fine. And that has to do with selection of provider. As far as general strategy matters, asset allocation, accounting determinations, the board will review decisions from the financial advisory committee, but will retain final authority. With regard to selection of consultants, they must screen and approve them. If they don't approve them, the board cannot act. And that's why it's a double veto.
Okay, say that again.
So that, let's say that the investment committee wants to select John Thompson as the investment manager. And they say he's a great guy, but he's a little young. So we're not approving. The board can't override.
Okay. Okay.
Now, I'm not saying that Mr. King and the board have agreed to that, but that's
All right. Thank you. And then on paragraph 2, I'm assuming from your comments that this is all stuff we're doing right now. There's nothing really new in here. You're just sort of codifying it. Is
I
that
think
right?
that's largely true, and Mr. King, he's nodding his head.
You're doing it already, John? Okay. The question that I had about the general counsel, and this is, I'm just not really sure. So how would it work if we were negotiating something, or we got into a spat and we had to litigate something? How does that work? Maybe Cindy can explain.
Because that happens today.
Well, I know, that's why I'm asking the question.
One of the geniuses of the consolidated charter is that the idea was to hold down that sort of thing.
Through the chairman, and that's right, and hence one of the issues in the federal litigation is, hey, you can't sue me. And the best way you look at it is putting aside the police and fire pension fund for all of the independent agencies and related agencies with the city. When they were all created, they're created without the power to sue the city. And it's more like they're subsidiaries of the city, so they have the independent corporate responsibilities, but not the ability to sue the city. It does, when you get good counsel, it just typically does work out. You know, many of the independents have needs, just like pension funds, for expert counsel, but not being able to sue the city results in this type of a resolution. You have the problem, you bring it to the people who are funding it, and you suggest proper resolutions within the law.
It's a very powerful position. But what the charter says, even with that, is that if the general counsel makes the decision, it's binding until otherwise overruled by a circuit judge,
Right.
or in the case of state matters, by the attorney general.
Right.
So how does that play out? Suppose the fund disagreed with the decision, how would they get it to the circuit judge?
If it were an issue of state law, then it can go to the AGO's office versus a circuit court. If it's an issue of local law, if it's how the charter is interpreted, then that's just the way that works. You know, there has to be a final decision, and it's...
So who would bring so presumably the fund would then seek a declaratory action from...
They could file an action if it were an issue of state law. Typically, if we have a disagreement on an issue of state law, we ask the general counsel's office with the police and fire pension fund. Historically, there's been a tension there, and people kind of run and get it, and get it in the back. On non-state, there's just a final answer. What does the charter say? The charter says what the general counsel says it says, and better for worse. No, not on the charter. No, on the charter, nobody cares but the city, is kind of how that goes, and so they let you, that's an internecine squabble, and so there are many circuit court decisions that say if it's just a question of the charter, then that's a political solution. Go somewhere else. If you don't like the general counsel's decision, go back to the legislature, go to the city council, which can change a great deal of the charter. If it's an issue of state law, then that gets changed. And of course, the charter language doesn't affect civil rights and things of that nature. It's just, it's actually fairly limited.
Well, let's suppose there's a public records request.
State law is public records.
Right, so the fund has a history of being very strict in determining whether they're going to comply. We've heard a presentation.
Yes.
I'm not saying whether that's right or wrong, but that's their policy. So they say, well, we're not going to give it to you. The general counsel says, well, you know what? You're only talking about a couple $100 to charge you. You ought to go ahead and do it even though it's, you know.
Yes.
So you say that, so what if they disagree?
If they disagree, that's an issue clearly under public records of state law. You could go to the AGO's office and say, hey, they're not handing over public documents, and the AGO's office would do them. There really are fairly limited issues that are only charter issues, fairly limited.
And in the case of any kind of negotiations between the two parties, how would that work?
In the same way it has, for 43 or so years, there's one legal answer, and then the policy people negotiate what they want to do about that. It's rare that the legal is a deciding point. So if we have a difference of opinion, for example, with JEA, there's one legal opinion from our office on what the law is, and now the policymakers address what they want to do with that answer.
So in that setting, the fund, if it were a matter related to something under the actuarial stuff or whatever, they could take that to the attorney.
Yes, because that would be the state law and the interpretation of that.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to make sure.
Your question is about this subject?
Yeah.
About this subject.
Okay, let's continue. Kirsten.
So does the fund retain the right to say, either currently as well as under your proposal, does the fund retain the right to say, no, this is a matter about which the Office of General Counsel cannot represent the fund. We need to engage our private counsel?
Presently, that is how it's been working because one general counsel, Judge Harrison, reached that conclusion. No other general counsel has agreed with that. The fact that they have good outside counsel that when I was in private practice, I hired one of my government clients, really has set that at a minimum. It's this larger issue is the only issue that we've actually had of any substance is a 30-year agreement valid, has been the only issue that we really have been unable to resolve with them. Anything else is really little internecine skirmishes that we end up just ignoring.
So that if you took the position, I think one of John's fears was, well, if we agree to this, then Cindy can just say the 30-year agreement is valid. Or it's invalid. It's invalid. So if they disagree with that, what would the recourse?
Well, the 30-year agreement saying it's valid or invalid, again, is dependent upon Florida law. It's Chapter 447. It's a constitutional right to bargain. So there is a form, which is why in that we are in federal court and we are in front of a hearing officer on that. So there are a number of issues in which you sit down with the mutual goal of does it matter on the ultimate, what's your resolution as opposed to the process. Often when the questions on the attorneys back and forth, that's the process question. The resolution is usually something that the policymakers can address with some legal guidance, and especially on something, one issue really for the police and fire pension fund is the actuarial reports. The other is something we had discussed, the disability payments. For us, we're all in the same position on disability. What's the answer? What's the standard? And 90%, 99% of the time, we're in accord with everything else. But most things do affect, are determined by a state law. Very few by the charter itself.
Okay. Kirsten, are you through?
I just want one.
Yeah.
I just don't see, and Mr. King obviously can speak to this, but it strikes me that the fund cannot take a position to agree to accept as binding opinions from the Office of General Counsel, where the client of the Office of General Counsel, that fiduciary duty is different. It's owed to different people.
No. I disagree, and the simplest issue is look at Coca-Cola. They have subsidiaries. The subsidiaries don't sue Coca-Cola. The attorneys can advise them on both. There's no breach. There is one, when you look at the power of the entity, if the power of the entity is not capable of suing, you have all these powers. You have a bundle, for example, they can't go out and invest in charities. That's not one of their powers. Neither is it one of their powers to sue the city. Then they just don't have that power. The fiduciary obligation from the city, from the general counsel, and as an attorney, Ms. Doolittle, each of us, each time we advise a client, we have a different level of fiduciary duties. If I'm dealing with a mid-level employee, it's very different. If I'm dealing with the CEO, I advise the board, I advise the CEO day to day. If there's a dispute between the two, the board wins. So it's not a unique principle of law that we're applying here. It really is a policy call, a level of comfort. And historically, we have always engaged specialized counsel on pension matters. We do in the city. That's why Mr. Lynn's here, because it is a unique and complex area of practice for which a general practitioner in the general counsel's office could not keep up.
I understand, and that was interesting. I guess you as the general counsel can make decisions, opinions of the general counsel, and if it's between two city agencies, that's something that doesn't go outside of the city, I suppose. But I would suppose that an individual, for instance, an individual employee or somebody who is a member of the pension system, could pursue a declaratory action based on the actions taken by the pension fund, or take a cert petition or something like that.
Well, through the chair, again, standing for individuals is actually far more limited on just about everything against the city than one would imagine. So you'd have to see what type of thing. And a good example, of course, a Title VII, a discriminatory action, of course, they have a right to address that. The day-to-day management to the fund, no. So we'd have to look at on the factual situation.
I'm sensing rolling the bounds by the non-lawyers. We've got 4 lawyers basically.
Yeah.
So we'll all bring our opinions. I want to say, I just looked at my watch, I want to save time for David Drain's presentation and for John Keene also, because it's now close to 11:30. I don't want to cut anybody off, but Greg, you still have.
Let me just finish up by saying in paragraph 5 on page 4, there is a bill that's going through council. This will be the second or third time that the bill has been considered and voted on it. And this would address at least what in the past has been the city council's desire to have a fifth member appointed by the fifth member appointed by the city council. So to whatever degree the committee considers this, I'm only pointing out that there is a current bill in place which is requesting the legislature to address this.
Let me ask you this, and you're not the council president, so you may not be able to answer it. But given the work of the committee and the global nature of this, would the council be willing to defer that until we finished our work?
Mr. Chairman, I'm only one vote. I know that the Finance Committee has already approved it, and it will require legislative action. So the whole idea is it's got to get to Tallahassee in time. And so I would encourage you to talk to Mr. Gulliford, who feels very strongly about it.
I want to give some comfort to John Keene that we're not doing with one hand what we're...
Well, that's the reason I'm pointing this out to you.
So it's really a timing thing,
right,
so that we still have an opportunity. Legislature not meet until March, and we'll be done from that, so we could request that meeting done.
I would encourage you to talk to Mr. Gulliford. Okay. Thank you. And I just wanted to make sure we pointed that. Let me see if there's anything else that I really... the last point is, and this is just for the chair and the committee's consideration, the bill that is in front of council right now, which was authored by Councilmember Schellenberg, speaks to investment authority changes. It originally started out in one direction. It has gone in an entirely different direction. It has, and you had mentioned it already, Bill, it has been approved by one committee, Rules. It was voted 6-0 on enrolls and rules and deferred in 2 other committees. I only bring that to the committee's attention in case this body might want to provide an opinion on the investment language. We certainly have some expertise now. Because right now what Mr. Schellenberg's doing is he's adding some different options which this committee may or may not have opinions on. And if you do, now would be a good time to consider it.
That's my intention, and what I really need, and Cindy, I'm going to ask you, could we get a red line of what the existing investment authority is with what is trying to be added? Because the way I got it, I had a legislation over here and I had this over there, and I couldn't.
Oh, sure, we'll get.
So that would help us.
I'll send it to Carol to circulate to everyone, the red line.
Yeah. Okay. John?
I hate to extend, but to me, it's sort of a key principle, and one of the things that's concerned me most around structural stuff, and that has to do with basically who bears the risk and how the structure supports that. So it may tie in those two issues, but not directly related to them, and that is, in a hypothetical situation, let's do forward-looking at this point, there's an underperformance on the part of the fund, and the risk is borne by the city. What is the mechanism by structure and governance that we would propose to deal with that problem? Forward-looking at this point, how do we suggest that gets remedied?
I don't think we can statute, because the statute imposes the duty upon the city to fund whatever the actuarial determination is at 100%. If the investments go down, the city, that's just the way it is. So the way you do it is to build into the governance people that will be qualified to make those decisions, knowing that there's a risk.
Right.
So that you just build it. I think even if you say the council is going to elect the third member, you still have the same risk.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, anything the council does is a political decision. So that risk doesn't go away.
Okay.
So you try to protect yourself as much.
By having, and the Investment Advisory Council, we believe, would provide the expertise necessary to assure or to have our best chance that won't take place.
What do y'all think about John's idea to expand the geographical? It seemed to me to be a good idea.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. Charles?
Two other minor questions, or detailed questions. On paragraph 8, maybe it's important, I don't know what the Florida Retirement System Special Risk Plan means. If we're going to vote to approve it, I have no idea what the last sentence means. It may be fine. The other question I have is under paragraph 9, under the special master, a quarterly basis seems fairly often. I don't. It seems like maybe a lot of work, a lot of expense, and maybe an annual or
semi-annual. I think it needs to be more than annual.
Yeah.
Okay, but quarterly seems you can spend a lot of time just trying to get information.
Semi-annual? Not intense, okay. All right. Back to the retirement system special risk plan, that has to do with the distribution. Chris added that. Let's don't take it up now, but Chris, will you be prepared to explain that next time? Okay. David, Grant, and John.
Just a quick comment on the frequency of the actuarial evaluations. Doing it on a 4 times a year would be an additional level of effort. Whether there's some sort of, and annually is really what you need to have an ongoing sense of how things are going.
So semi-annual would still be, that's enough to keep, what we're trying to do is keep people's feet to the fire. And so we want to make sure that the city is performing and the fund is performing.
One, so things like monitoring whether contributions are being made on a quarterly basis is obviously part and parcel of that. Just doing the full actuarial evaluation on 4 times a year or even twice a year really would add a lot of administrative costs and doesn't necessarily get you a lot of additional information that would be actionable.
So I think I'm hearing you say that quarterly really is appropriate.
Quarterly on the actual evaluation is more than
that. But on the other,
an annual is both sufficient and appropriate.
Robert.
Okay. I was just going to second what David said. To do an actuarial evaluation is probably a 3-month process, I'm guessing, from when John Keene first provides the data to the actuary. So he would just be finishing up evaluations. You have to start the next one because you have to gather the census data. So the liabilities are usually only measured once a year. You can look at the assets quarterly. I think they're measured quarterly. But again, you can, trend the liability, but you're not going to get any, new findings like you would do as part of an annual evaluation.
So if we provided for annual and then said that if either party felt that it needed some additional insight, they could request a meeting, something like that.
Right, but if you think about it, the valuation measures the liabilities. One of the items they measure is, for instance, is salaries. You project current salary. Usually people get pay raises only once a year. And so if you measure liabilities 2 quarters in a row where there's no pay raise in between, you're not getting anything. You want to pick up everything, and that's why, and I noticed that in one of the earlier paragraphs, there is a requirement that you do annual evaluations, which I think we both agree is very important.
Are y'all happy with moving the
Yes.
monitoring to annual? And
Yeah.
Keith and I want to hear what John has said about that, because I think he was particularly concerned that we get some court supervised monitoring of what.
On the liability side, I just want to make sure.
Yes, okay, right. Okay, other questions? Gwen, you have a question?
So are we saying annual instead of semi-annual?
I'm hearing annual. Subject to what Mr. Dean has to say.
My thoughts are, semi-annual gives you an idea, or you see red flags, or it gives you a little bit of a heads up before the end of the year that you need to make some corrections, or...
So that on the investment performance and that sort of stuff, maybe more frequent, but it's the actuarial stuff that's on there. I'll try to recap that. Good, thank you. Okay, well, y'all reflect upon this, and hopefully we'll be able to take some action on this if we come back. Now, remember, it's only part of the report, it's just okay, David Drain, would you make your presentation? This is going to be on pension modeling. Cindy Greg can stay, he just can't say anything that night. Okay, you can stay, but you can't say. Good.
All right, well, good morning, and thanks again for having me here today. And for the record, David Drain from the Pew Charitable Trusts. And I'd like to cover 2 things in this. One is just share some analyses on plan design and help the task force understand some of the different options it might consider. And then secondly, just share some of the benchmarking data we've collected showing how PFPF in Jacksonville compared to some other Florida cities. So in the spirit of time, I'll just try to go quickly, particularly over stuff that we've already shared. We think that there's 4 components of any good plan design: fully funding benefits and making sure that contributions are never skipped, making sure all vested workers have a path to retirement, a secure retirement, making sure that investments are professionally managed and low fee, and making sure that every worker has access to annuities so they never run out of retirement savings. So based on the last meeting in December, we were asked to present 2 different options for new police and fire workers in Jacksonville. And one is based on the recommendations of the mediated settlement plan and includes and modifies the existing defined benefit plan going forward. We were also asked to look at what's referred to as stacked hybrid plan, where there's both a final average salary defined benefit, but one that is smaller and is accompanied by a defined contribution plan to make up the rest of the retirement benefit. These plans are designed to have similar cost if all assumptions hold, though any final plan recommended by the task force could be made either more or less generous than either of these options. So if you like the basic approach of the final average salary defined benefit, in the mediated settlement agreement, but think it needs to be, give a better benefit, obviously that can be tweaked or vice versa. And really, we want to help our analysis to help the task force, understand these potential plans. And there's 3 ways one should assess any given plan. One is simply cost, but the second is risk. How much uncertainty is there, and who bears that uncertainty, whether it's the employer or the employee or shared in some way. And then finally, benefits. What are workers getting? Is that, one, going to give them a secure retirement? Are they going to be able to retire with an adequate benefit? And 2, how is it rewarding work over a career? Are you creating the right incentives to get the talented police and fire employees that Jacksonville needs? The modeling work is based on the assumptions used by Jacksonville Police and Fire pension funds. Unless otherwise stated, the assumed rate of return is 7%. And all figures assume that the current share of chapter funds devoted to paying the ARC continue to do so and are used to pay part of the normal cost. As a caveat, these are preliminary numbers. Part of what our actuaries like to do in coming up with a final analysis is really take some time to do a number of calibrations, and we haven't been able to finish that step in the process. So plan parameters, obviously we wanted to look at the current plan being offered in order to have a baseline. We then, looking at the final average salary defined benefit plan from the mediated settlement agreement. And then thirdly, the stacked hybrid plan. And I want to go into a little more detail on that to help. So first, this has changed slightly since what was presented in December. Most importantly, in December, our analyses were based on the assumed rate of return of 7.25%. But given that the task force expressed an interest in looking at 7% assumed rate of return, we modeled that, and as a result, the cost of the defined benefit side went up slightly, and the benefits in the defined contribution side went down slightly to match that. Second is going back to those 4 principles we talked about earlier. If you're going to offer a defined contribution plan as either part or the entirety of one's benefit, you need to make sure it's going to be a good, effective plan for offering retirement security. And the 2 pieces that are necessary to include in that are, 1, having good, limited, low-fee investment options for employees. When we looked at, for example, states that have offered defined contribution plans and turned back from that model, one of the things that they have cited, so Nebraska and West Virginia both offered defined contribution plans to all their employees. In both cases, they decided that they had to go back to a defined benefit model because employees were not given the right investment options and weren't getting retirement security. So, broadly, there should be a limited pool of options. They should be, well-designed, diversified options that will help manage risk and give good returns, and they should be low fee. And then second, as I said, access to annuities is an important protection for workers. And if you're going to offer, once again, a defined contribution plan as the entirety or part of your benefit, you need to offer within the plan access to annuities so someone can buy or get a benefit that's going to last their entire lifetime. And there's a number of ways to do it. One option is to do it within the plan itself. The defined contribution plans, both in the public sector and the private sector, for example, TIA CREP, do that within the plan, or you might look for a third party, though likely doing it within the plan will be a more efficient option. So these are the plan costs under current assumptions for both the current plan, the proposed new defined benefit plan, and the new hybrid plan. And really the 2 takeaways from this are, 1, simply changing plan benefits has basically no cost impact on the short term, has a real cost impact in the middle term, but one that is dwarfed by the cost of the unfunded liabilities. And really you see the savings in those out years when the unfunded liability is paid off. And second, just simply making the point that as per design, the new defined benefit plan and the new hybrid plan cost a very similar amount. These are annual savings from the potential new plans. Once again, both lines basically overlap, and this just shows the point that the annual savings are fairly low in the short term. And these are then total projected costs over the entire period we're looking at. These figures have not been adjusted for inflation. So the current plan is projected to all-in contributions from now through 2044, about $6.1 billion. And both of these new plan options over this total period save about $1 billion in employer contributions. So we talked about cost, but obviously a big impact of this is risk. A lot of what, in fact, the funding subcommittee was looking at is there's a lot of uncertainty about what a pension plan is going to cost over the next 30 years. There's a lot of uncertainty in any sort of planning over decades, and retirement is no different. And so this is looking at, so first, the yellow is the baseline. This is if you kept current policy and investment returns were 7%. And the other ones are looking at both the current plan, the new defined benefit, and the new hybrid if plan returns were just 5.4%. To go into a little more detail about how we look at these investment assumptions. So, to clarify, we're not investment experts. We're not in a position to go and say, this 7% return is right, it's too high, it's too low. That takes a lot of specialized analysis. What the people who do that analysis do is they look at all the different investments that a plan is invested in. For each one of these, they're doing it according to best practices to say, all right, the equities we're invested in, what do we think they're likely to get, and what's the distribution? Trying to estimate the future, what's the percent chance that they're going to hit various targets? And they do that for each asset class, and they combine them together. And so they both have what they think they're going to get, and a whole range of distributions around that. And what we do is then, taking that investment assumption, we try to back in to try to get a sense of what the distribution is. And so that 7% assumption, that's a bullseye on the dartboard. And we want to know, well, if you're throwing a lot of darts, where are they going to land? And some of them are going to land below that, and some of them are going to land above that.
David, just to help me on this slide, going back to David Moore's committee, is this slide saying that if you have an assumed rate of return, which we talked about being voluntary contributions, of 5.4, does that mean you're at $500 million?
So this is if actual investments, if the assumed rate of return stays at 7%, but actual investments experienced are 5.4. So, and that drives, under the current plan, that would drive total costs to be more than $500 million.
That's the end.
In 2035.
On the bottom, it says they're based on a 7% return, and then on top it says 5.4.
That's a typo in the slide, my apologies.
Okay.
So what is it, 7 or 5?
It's 5.4.
So how does that help me understand how that's
So the thing that's important to show is, so what, on the new plan options, both the new defined benefit and the new hybrid, one of the, there's two real differences task force should consider. One is how they handle risk. So under the current plan, the employer bears all the risk. What a hybrid plan does is shares some of that risk, because it's got the defined benefit portion where the employer keeps the risk, and the defined contribution portion where all the risk goes to the employee. As a result, if investments are lower than expected, the hybrid option wouldn't have costs go up as much. By the same token, if investments are lower than expected, employees would get less of a benefit. So it's not eliminating the risk. It's simply taking some of that risk from the employer and giving it to the employee. And so this looks at what total costs are under different return scenarios. So what are projected total costs if returns are 7%? And those are the same figures that you saw in that previous table. Then, if actual returns are 5.4%, what are total costs? Third is, what does that change? So, under the current plan, if returns are 5.4% and all the and all current policies are held the same, costs are expected to increase by $1.7 billion. If instead the new defined benefit is put in place going forward and returns are just 5.4%, costs still increase, but they only increase by $1.5 billion. And finally, if a new hybrid plan was in place and returns were just 5.4%, costs would go up by $1.45 billion. Now, part of the reason you don't see that big a change between the potential defined benefit and the potential hybrid is that, one, a lot of these costs are for the existing benefits, the existing liabilities. Two is that, at the end of the period, there's going to be an unfunded liability, and the hybrid plan is better funded. So, not only would you have paid $100 million less, but you've also got, about $70 million less in unfunded liabilities. And then thirdly is simply that, a hybrid plan is still making a defined benefit promise to workers, and if investments fall short of assumed or assumptions, you're going to see costs go up. Oh, and just to clarify, and this is probably wasn't the best way to have written it, but so the cost projections we're seeing here. So the assumed rate of return being used by the plan is 7%, and then we're looking at what happens if returns fall short of 7%. So, as opposed to we're saying, another way to have analyzed this would say, well, what if the discount rate was switched to 5.4%? But
No, because if it's switched to 5.4% and returns are 5.4%, the costs are going to be pretty similar. They wouldn't have this disparity. This is just if the returns are different.
Yeah, but in terms of, say, this graph, if the assumed rate of return was 5.4%, you'd see more costs in those early years and lower costs in the out years. And as we see in this chart.
But these calculations assume that the minimum required contribution is made each year. I think that's the difference. You're only doing the minimum required, so cumulatively, you have a much larger annual contribution because you got to make up the shortfall.
That's the answer. Okay, thank you. That does, okay.
So then, those are two of the three ways that one needs to analyze a pension plan. But the third one is what benefits are people going to get, and what are they expected to get over a career. And so this looks at the value of the retirement benefits. You start at 25. What's the value of the benefits you've accumulated as you continue working? Both looking at the current plan, the mediated settlement agreement plan, and the hybrid plan. Once again, based on someone entering at 25 and based on plan assumptions. And I think the important takeaways from this, one, both plans are a substantial cut from the status quo. It's a large reduction in benefits that workers are going to be expecting. Two is, particularly in the first 25 years of service, the mediated settlement agreement plan gives a very modest benefit. And once you hit the 25th year of service and are eligible for early retirement, the value of your benefits really jumps up. This is really good if you want to give a strong incentive to workers you have within your system to stay. It, could potentially be a problem if you're having trouble recruiting people who don't anticipate staying a full career. Now, because this is a public safety plan, because these are police and fire workers who really are much more likely to work a full career, this is, this wouldn't be as, designing it like this is a lot more appropriate when you've got that population. If you're looking at for general city employees or teachers or state employees, many people don't spend a full career in any one job. They don't spend a full career in any public service job. When you're looking at police and fire, they're much more likely to, and that design reflects that. Conversely, the hybrid plan gives a much more generous benefit to that worker who joins at 25 and leaves at 40 or leaves at 45. But is not as generous to that worker who starts at 25 and leaves at 50 or leaves at 55. So this just takes away the current plan so you can see the differences between the mediated settlement agreement proposal and the hybrid plan. Now, one of the things about a hybrid plan, so it's less risk for the employer, it's more risk for the employee. And so we wanted to look at benefits. Returns may not be 7%. They may be a lot lower or a lot higher than that. So the green line is that mediated settlement agreement plan. And the various purple lines are what the hybrid plan does if returns are either 7%, lower than that at 5.4%, much lower than that at 3.9%, or higher than that at 8.6. So looking at the extremes, at 8.6%, returns are that for the hybrid plan. You're seeing a very strong benefit that's not only much greater in those early years, but is in fact equal to the benefit offered by the mediated settlement proposal in in those high years at the end. Conversely, if returns are just 3.9%, you're looking at a benefit that's, just at what the mediated settlement proposal does for those early years, and then doesn't go any higher when someone's reached 25 years of service. So by taking on less risk from the employer, that risk is going to the employee and is going to affect his or her benefits. So those are the three things we wanted to share with you on plan design. Once again, when looking at a plan, one should be considering costs, risk, and employee benefits. And just to give the opportunity for questions on that.
Sorry, which is the line for that represents a 7% return?
It's the solid line in the middle. So if you
So on the
look-
printout, is it a dotted one?
No, 7% return is a solid line. It's the, sure. It is, it's dotted here and not, yeah, okay, it's the dashes and dots on the printout, and somehow it's appearing differently on
It's okay.
on the screen. So yeah, the 7% returns is on the printout, it's the dash and dot. On the screen, it's appearing as a solid line.
And then the 8.6% return?
That's the top line.
That's the top line, okay.
If you've got, I know this doesn't take into account like turnover costs and that type of thing. If you do have, and I understand the sheriff is very concerned about turnover cost in the agency, a plan like the new defined benefit plan would be one that would encourage people to stay for at least a minimum amount of time to reduce turnover. Is that right?
Yeah, and maybe a good way to say this, from the employer side,
Yeah.
from everything we've heard, talking to stakeholders, talking to people in Jacksonville, there's there's not a lot of concern about the ability to recruit, and there's a lot of concern about the ability to retain. From the employer side, that new defined benefit plan on the, in terms of human resource impacts, is going to better match that. Now, conversely, from the employee side, a lot of workers spend a full career, but to the extent that we want to make sure that everyone who enters is going to get at least be put on a path to retirement, that's the argument for the hybrid approach. Whether that would now on, yeah. So from the employer side, from what we've heard, that defined benefit plan is going to better match what the goals are. From the employee side, there's going to be workers who end up not getting as much.
And I tried to do some research on academic articles on different plans, and there just doesn't seem to be a lot. There's something from the University of Massachusetts that I thought I sent to the group that did come out in terms of the cost of various plans. Do you know of much? Is there, in terms of turnover cost and worker productivity cost over time? Do you know of anything that in the academic literature?
There's some studies looking at, there's some studies that look at what happens if you change plans and what does that do to workers, and that doesn't really answer that question. There's not a whole lot there. The other piece of it is that almost certainly if you were saying, what is the impact on these different things for a teaching workforce, that's going to give you a very different answer than what is the impact of these different things for a police and fire workforce. So, when we look at, for example, there's been some research that's, looks at these kind of issues with teachers. And, with teachers, you've got a lot of changing jobs, within the career track of education, but you've also got, many people, you look at a teacher plan and their assumptions for how many people they retain. So pension plans, as part of their cost calculations, need to have withdrawal assumptions. So you look at a teacher's plan, they assume they're going to lose 50% in the first 5 years, at least. You look at the assumptions that Jacksonville Police and Fire uses, and assumptions that are backed up by their experience, a very large chunk are going to spend a full career. And so, the impact on a school district trying to manage these is going to be very different than on a police department or a fire department.
And is there any literature on what happens to if you have folks on less of a defined benefit plan, if you have more hospital turnover? Is there any literature on what that does to the need for future pay raises and that type of thing? What does that do to overall salary, not just the pension, but looking at compensation issues in the future? Do you know anything? I couldn't find anything.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's much there, unfortunately.
Yeah, because it would seem to me that if you don't have people locked in for long term, you're going to have to, from time to time, when you have issues of keeping folks on the payroll, you're going to have to pay them. So I was surprised that I couldn't find anything on that.
Yeah, and it's going to, if your main challenge is recruitment,
Yeah.
then something like a hybrid plan, maybe more people coming in are going to know that I've got a better shot of getting, I don't need to wait as long to get that benefit. You may need to, it may reduce the need for high salaries on the recruitment side, but then hurt on retention and vice versa. So it's balancing both those factors from a workforce perspective.
I had some questions on, I mean, it's a good point about retention issues. In a defined contribution plan, if you wanted to, you could have a contribution rate that would change based upon age and years of salary, right? So you could make it a much heavier contribution in your later career and a much lighter contribution in your early year, get the same overall effects. But you could do some things if you really wanted to focus on, if you liked it otherwise, and you wanted to try to make it more responsive. There were things I think you could do, right?
Yeah, and we wanted to, there's a lot of flex, you could design a defined benefit plan that looks like a defined contribution plan and vice versa.
Right.
So it's, the point is to, there's a lot of flexibility within these big design choices to do what you want. Ultimately, the question is, one, how do you want to handle risk? Do you want to expose employees to risk that the employer has previously been keeping on? And two, do you want a backloaded benefit or do you want a smooth benefit?
And on that question, so let's look at two really relevant things. So let's say, because the place this thing starts to diverge is where somebody has risk to share. So let's look at the 5.4%, because risk got to be shared in that example, right? Where we're assuming 7 and earning 5.4. So the defined benefit plan is the green line. Help us again, which one is the hybrid 5.4?
It's the dash purple.
The dash purple, so the second line from the bottom.
Correct.
Okay, so and for the defined benefit plan, this assumes you retire when you can retire and you start drawing your benefits? And
it assumes you retire at the point where, so if you're leaving at 30, it's assuming you retire the first year you're able to retire. If you're, so you're retiring at 62 in that case. If you're leaving at age 30. If you're, leaving at age 50, then it's assuming you're.
So this is the retirement age at the bottom.
It's the departure age.
Departure age. But so, like for instance, why does the purple line, the relevant purple line, get above the green line at the far right?
So a couple reasons. So first, in general, as I get a long-term service with a final average salary defined benefit plan, each year I work, I'm losing a year of benefits because I'm eligible to retire. And so I may be getting a higher benefit, but if I'm getting one fewer year of benefits, the total benefit I'm entitled to is going down. As opposed to a hybrid plan where that's true for the defined benefit portion, but my defined contribution account keeps growing and doesn't have that cap.
So this stands for at age 59. If an employee worked at age 59 and there was only a 5.4% return, he'd earn just as much as he would under a DB plan. If he stays later, even later than that, which might be unusual, but if he stays even later than that, he would make more. And it's only where a retirement occurs before age 59 that you start to have any cost, even at 5.4%, under going to a hybrid plan, from an employee's perspective.
Yeah, so from the employee's perspective, if I'm an employee and I know returns are going to be 5.4%, and you tell me, either option one is, being a police officer or firefighter, it's not going to be for you. You're going to leave after 15 years. I definitely would want to be in the hybrid plan. Similarly, if you said being a police officer or firefighter is completely for you, you're never going to want to leave. You're going to want to, you're not going to want to leave until age 60 or 65. Hybrid plan would be better. That being said, when you look at the actual demographics of the system, people are tending to retire in those middle years, and that is when a lot of people leave. So yeah, the two things that kind of a final average salary defined benefit does So one, for that person who leaves, after 10 years of service or 15 years of service, he or she does not get nearly as good a benefit. And then second, once you've kind of hit this retirement eligibility point, every year you work, you're losing benefits, you're getting forced out. And either that's going to kind of match your workforce goals, and it's going to help you achieve them, or it's going to hurt your workforce goals.
By that, I guess you mean you don't want folks much over 55 doing law enforcement or public safety.
And once again, for public safety, there's a lot stronger rationale for, so if you look at, once again, education, if you're forcing out experienced teachers, you may be really losing something of a lot of value. There's a real policy question of, is there an age cap that someone can be an effective educator? For police and fire, kind of the rationale for saying, at this point, we really would like you to retire is much stronger.
So from the employee perspective, I think this is really helpful because this is where the rubber meets the road. If you're building a plan with the expectation that folks are staying the 20 or 25 years, and first of all, if we earned 7%, there'd be no difference between being in a DB plan or a hybrid plan. If returns actually are 7%, you're getting an equivalent outcome both ways, right?
Employees as a whole. Now, different employees are going to get a better or lesser benefit.
Good point. But as a whole, that's a good point. And then, so it's only where we have a risk, the hybrid plan, as you appropriately point out, shifts risk to an employee. That comes to bear where investment performance is less than the 7% that's been assumed in the high end of the DB plan. And where that hits is for folks that want to retire between age 50 and age 59. That's where that hits. And it can be mitigated if you're willing to stay for a longer career, and that's the value judgment that comes.
I think it's less than 8.6%, because the top line is 8.6 rather than 7.
So if it's 5.4 and you've taken risk, you lose in a hybrid plan as an employee between ages 50 and 59, it looks like. Because the purple line is below the green line in that one segment of time.
And just to add on, a big part of the reason you see that drop to 55 in the green line is because there's, and this may show it better, is that there's that cap on benefits. So benefits cannot grow more than, I believe, MSP.
The MSP caps out after 30 years.
Yeah, at 75%. So, because there's that cap, once you've hit 30 years of service, you really have a strong incentive to, at that point, retire.
Right.
Which, once again, may be the objective, if that's the objective of the plan, that's going to help encourage that.
And I misspoke, so we don't confuse everybody. Maybe it was Ted's question. Every line is below the green line between age 50 and 59.
Yes.
So under every scenario, in that age period is where you get a difference impact between as you define it, right? Okay.
Yes.
And can I go back to the cost side again for a second?
Sure.
So like on slide 9, as you pointed out, slide 9 is hard to appreciate because the scale, right? What we're really talking about is benefits prospectively for new employees. The MSP versus hybrid, so it's really new employees that are being affected by that. So if you're really trying to isolate the relevant group, which is just payments on behalf of new benefits for new employees, to your point, you have to look all the way out to where the unfunded liability goes away, right?
Yep.
And so the questions I had was, and we said before, the way you compare cost is normal cost. What's the normal cost between the DB plan and the hybrid plan if we assume a 5.4% actual experience?
And we don't have that number yet, but.
Okay.
You will at the next.
Okay. And then this assumes chapter funds reduce the city's costs?
Yeah.
If you didn't assume that, that should be separately stated as well, because that may not always be there. So how do you look at it with and without chapter funds?
In both, kind of in all three cases, the impact of chapter funds would be the same. So if chapter funds went away, all three lines would go up by about, 4.5% of pay. If all chapter funds went into paying for this, all would go down in equal amount. So I mean, it doesn't tell you the relative, there's no relative impact. So.
Well, in the DC part of the hybrid plan, would make a difference.
I mean, from what we've been, given that, our understanding is that Jacksonville is deemed to comply, and thus having a partial DC component would not impact. Obviously, if that's not the case, then if chapter funds go away in instituting hybrid, that obviously changes the cost picture substantially.
Let's hold that until we get into the design, because I do want to have time for John Keane to talk to us. So the next is the benchmarking.
One comment on slide 16. I've spoken to retired public safety workers, and I thought it was an interesting comment. They said, look, their view was this retirement plan was designed to encourage them to retire at age 50. If you look at that, it almost leads you to that conclusion. But if, at age 50, it starts leveling out. So they really wanted us to retire then. That's what the plan was designed to do, and that's what, that's true. That was their perception.
Which turns out to be
Harder to chase bad guys.
Yeah, I understand that part.
Okay, on the benchmarking, you want to just take that real quick, or do we, once you do that real quick, because then, let's not go through the, explain the tables generally, then we can look at those between now and then.
Yeah,
explain Tampa to the bottom.
Yes, please.
So the two pieces, this is looking at both funding information for large Florida cities, what the funding ratio, what the assumed rate of return is, required contributions and member contributions, and then the second piece is just giving basic benefit parameters for those same cities. And kind of the key takeaways. So one, Jacksonville is an outlier on funding is the lowest we've seen. Two, they're actually, they're on the low end for Florida cities on the assumed rate of return. So at the current, or the proposed 7% assumed rate of return, they're the lowest among these major cities. Thirdly, they're not an outlier in terms of benefits, in either direction, that both in terms of retirement age and the benefit formula, they're pretty similar. Now, one cautionary note is that, really in assessing the total impact of the plan, you include all factors. So things like COLAs and spousal benefits and all those pieces are what drives the total cost. But at least in terms of basic benefit parameters, they're not an outlier there. And then in terms of Tampa, Katie, do you want to add in on are you asking about the Tampa member contributions? Yes.
Yeah.
Did you do anything on salaries for these different folks too? Because just in the
not in a way that could really be done for apples to apples. So, we at least in our discussions with Sheriff's Office and stakeholders here, it's very clear that different cities have very different demographics and the kind of people they target for police and fire. Whether it's and we just don't have enough from the information we're able to access to say, our salary difference we're seeing, is it because they've got a younger or older workforce, or is it their real cost differences? So we didn't feel that the information we're able, and in many cases, our only way of getting is to go to the pension disclosures and go, well, what's total payroll, what's total membership, which is, we were just lacking the data to be comfortable having that.
Katie, welcome to Jack.
Thank you. I'm Katie Selensky. So there was a question about the 25% on Tampa. Unfortunately, I don't have at the tip of my fingers the detail on the variability, but we can provide that in follow-up.
But these were taken from, among other things, from both city financials and also from the
actuarial evaluation.
My understanding is Tampa has a shared cost arrangement between participants in the plan and the employer.
That's right.
Okay, thank you very much.
One last question. Have any of these gone, I can't recall, which of these cities have gone through a restructuring of their pension?
So, I mean, the other piece of that is because a lot of these data are outdated, so Miami's done reforms as well as a couple others, but just because all these data precede the reforms, it just didn't, it wasn't a useful way of trying to divide these.
So none of this data is representative of cities that have had to address a pension issue?
I mean, some of them did have to address the pension issue. It's because we're pulling from different valuation dates, and because all of these, the most recent we have is 2012. None of these reflect any reforms that have occurred in the last 2 years. And so, as a caveat to this.
Thanks, David.
Changes.
Mr. King, would you speak to us, sir?
I'll be glad to, Mr. Chairman, but your time is up, and I know some of the people have to go. And I'd be glad to postpone my presentation to your next thing if it would suit the commissioners better.
What you will. I wanted John to give some at least brief, but it might fall better to have to be able to reflect upon it, what you've heard today, and so I appreciate that. But it's not that we want to exclude you.
Inclusion.
We want to be inclusive. That's right. Okay.
And there were a number of good questions that the commissioners brought up that I want to answer, but to answer them is going to take a few minutes, and then it's going to blow your schedule out. So.
Okay. We'll try to put you on first when we come back.
That'd be delightful.
Okay. Before we have public comment, it seems to me we're going to need at least 2 more meetings. We've got the meeting on the 21st. I think we need 2 in addition to that. So I asked Carol to put down some alternatives. My idea is that we take...
Mr. Chairman, you also had comments in here from Chris Ann here.
he really wants to put them off till next week.
I'm going to be aligned with my friend John.
Okay.
I already knew the answer to that.
Okay.
Thank you for reminding me.
I didn't know the answer to that.
My thought was that we would take one meeting the week of the, whatever the 29th falls in, and then do the second one. It's the 29th from 9 to 12, is that okay? That's a Wednesday. 29th, 9 to noon, going once, twice, 3 times. Okay, that's it. And then the next week, the 5th or the 6th.
I'll be out that entire week.
I'm out that week too.
So we ought to go to the next week. So the week of the 10th. How about the 12th? The 12th, 9 and then, Carol, that was one of the room locations, wasn't it? Okay, so our 2 meetings, and I really hope we'll be done then, because I know the council, I know the mayor, the king, and the council are all anxious to get our work done, but I think that's doing. David Drain and Jonathan Trichter and Katie, those dates okay with you guys?
I think so.
Okay.
The only point being is the ultimate conclusion to reconciliation might be most apropos on Valentine's Day.
Hey, John, right. We'll have our party on what do they call it, a closing dinner. Okay, public comment. Any public comment? Seeing no one, we are adjourned. I want to thank everybody. This was a long meeting. Lots of good. See you. Take care. Thank you very much. All right.